will settle down after their difficult weekend, they'll realise that this is in the interests of both Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and will support the Government's position.
Thank you. We now move to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney on financial implications from the UK Budget 2014. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on John Swinney. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this opportunity to update Parliament on a package of measures the Scottish Government intends to take forward to support Scotland's economy. I intend to allocate the consequential funding arising from the UK budget for our 2014-15 budget, along with some identified underspend from this year that I will carry forward. This package will support jobs, skills development and children and families, adding to the decisive steps this Government is already taking to help Scotland's economic recovery and build for the future. We do so against the backdrop of the UK Government's continuing cuts to public spending, confirmed again in last month's UK budget. Published alongside the budget were economic forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Their latest growth forecasts simply serve to remind us of how badly the UK Government mismanaged the recovery in the first place. The UK had one of the deepest and longest recessions of its G7 partners, and its average growth throughout the recovery has been weaker than the United States, Canada and Germany. All of this has resulted in the UK economy being further away from its pre-crisis levels of output than any country in the G7, with the exception of Italy. Despite the damaging approach being taken by the UK Government, Scotland's economy continues to overcome these obstacles, and we should be optimistic that we have put in place the foundations of longer-term recovery. Scotland continues to outperform the UK across all headline labour market indicators, with a lower unemployment rate, higher employment rate and lower economic inactivity rate. While the economic data is encouraging, we must reinforce our focus on delivering recovery. The peak-to-trough recession in Scotland was shallower than in the UK, in no small part due to our consistent and sustained investment in growth and capital infrastructure in particular. In a week where confidence in the construction sector in Scotland has reached its highest level since the start of the recession, our approach has to date mitigated the impact of the downturn on the Scottish economy. Whenever there has been an opportunity to further invest in our economy, the Government has taken it. That is why I am pleased to announce today a number of measures that will boost our economy, create jobs, support skills development and strengthen Scotland's infrastructure. Firstly, I wish to announce to Parliament that the Scottish Government will develop plans to extend our current programme of NPD investment, with additional investment taking us through to 2019-20. This programme will build on the successes of our current investments, delivering colleges, schools, roads, hospitals and community health facilities across Scotland. It will provide the construction sector with the long-term certainty of a future pipeline of work. It is affordable within the headroom of our 5% limit, which we chose to put in place to make sure we can deliver now for the economy without over-constraining future budget choices. The current revenue-funded programme is now delivering strongly. £650 million worth of projects started in construction in 2013-14, and we expect all the other major NPD projects to follow suit in the coming financial year. The procurement of the M8, M73, M74 only took 23 months from ODU to financial close. That is much quicker than the average preceding time of 36 months. There has been significant investor interest in financing the programme, and we continue to secure good value for money. Our schools programme continues on track to deliver 67 schools for the original price of 55, and the first of our new community health facilities is now in operation in the City of Aberdeen. We are keen to maintain this positive momentum and extend the programme further. We know that every additional £100 million of construction activity is estimated to support over 1,300 jobs, and then we get the long-term benefits of using that asset. I have therefore asked the Scottish Futures Trust to explore, with a range of public bodies, the development of robust business cases for individual projects. I will come back to Parliament with the details of the programme of investments in the draft budget in the autumn, which will total additional NPD investment of a further £1 billion in the Scottish economy. In addition, Presiding Officer, I also announce a further allocation of £10.3 million in financial transactions funding to provide shared equity capital support to the Help to Buy scheme in 2014-15. This will bring our overall investment in Help to Buy Scotland to £235 million over 3 years. In doing so, I recognise the benefits of that scheme to the construction sector and the wider economy, and the important role it plays in supporting aspiring homeowners throughout Scotland. This announcement does not preclude further decisions about financial transactions, and we will continue to listen to the industry and explore opportunities to build on the already significant package of support that we have put in place. Presiding Officer, I am pleased to confirm also to Parliament that the Scottish Government will provide an exceptional one-off contribution of £500,000 to Dumfries and Galloway Council to deal with the aftermath of recent flooding in the local area. I fully understand the extreme situation that the local authority has faced since the turn of the year, and this grant will allow the Council to carry out the required essential repair works to the infrastructure that has been affected. While there was a failure in the budget to reverse the capital budget cuts, the Chancellor did take the opportunity to reiterate the current UK Government's approach, which will see further public spending reductions until 2018-19. Indeed, based on the UK Government's projections, we have so far seen less than half of the Chancellor's cuts, with some 60% yet to come. The brunt of the austerity agenda is borne by some of the most vulnerable groups in our society. Earlier this year, we provided much-needed support to some of those vulnerable groups through our welfare reform mitigation and early years commitments. Today, I plan to go further in providing support to those vulnerable groups. Presiding Officer, despite the progress we are making in the labour market, the Government remains deeply concerned at the levels of youth unemployment. In the Budget Bill, I committed to bringing forward swift measures and appropriate resources to implement the recommendations of the Wood Commission on developing Scotland's young workforce. I today reaffirm that commitment and will ensure that the implications of the final report, due to be published in May, will be taken forward as part of the 2015-16 draft budget later this year. In the meantime, I take this opportunity to announce the allocation of £12 million this year to begin to implement the Wood Commission's recommendations and to further enhance our existing measures to support youth employment in programmes such as modern apprenticeships. Our young people deserve our best efforts, and we will do everything within our powers to improve their vocational pathways and provide employment opportunities. As the First Minister announced in January, we will further expand early learning and childcare to more of our most vulnerable 2-year-olds. This will benefit the children and also open up employment opportunities for their families by removing childcare as a barrier to work. To ensure we have the physical capacity to meet our commitment to expand childcare, I have decided to allocate all of the capital consequentials from the UK Government to local government. We will continue to work with our partners at COSLA to fully understand the capital cost implications of the expansion of childcare services, but the initial investment of £23.5 million in 2014-15 and £7.7 million in 2015-16 will emphasise our determination to properly resource our learning and childcare services within the constraints of devolution. The Government has made clear that we will allocate a full-year cost of £42 million to local authorities to fund the expansion of free school meal eligibility. Recent discussions with COSLA have persuaded me to allocate a further £12 million resource to local government on a full-year basis to replace the elements of subsidy that local authorities apply to provision of school meals across Scotland. The allocations for 2014-15 will be adjusted to reflect the start date of free school meal provision in January 2015. Access to a nutritious meal not only delivers better outcomes for our youngest learners, but also provides much welcome financial support to hard-pressed families, many of whom have been badly affected by the austerity agenda. We also know that disabled people and those with health conditions are likely to be negatively affected by a number of the welfare reforms and changes being introduced, such as the introduction of the personal independence payment, which is replacing disability allowance for working-age people. Ongoing issues with the work capability assessment used to determine entitlement to health-related benefits are also continuing to cause concern, with many people wrongly deemed fit for work. I therefore want to ensure more support and advice is available for those affected by the welfare reforms and benefit cuts, and today I am announcing a further £1 million in both this financial year and next to mitigate the impacts of welfare reform. Presiding Officer, we cannot undo all of the damage of welfare reform, the austerity agenda or the consequences of Westminster's economic mismanagement. The actions of this Government demonstrate, however, our determination to take the initiative where we can. The Treasury's own analysis accompanying the budget admitted that the average household will already be the equivalent of £757 worse off as a consequence of the cuts announced to date. In the poorest household, that rises to £814. We should genuinely worry about the damage that could be caused to our people and communities by the time we reach 2018-19. And yet, under the current constitutional arrangements championed by the other parties, Scotland would have had no option but to accept funding decisions taken by Westminster. Presiding Officer, this Government will continue to argue that Scotland deserves better. We deserve real control over our finances, and our people deserve the right to take their own decisions about the economy, taxation, public spending and public services.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Ian Gray. Mr Gray, you've got just over a minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. The last time the Cabinet Secretary allocated consequentials, as he told us, in January, he used them to extend free school meals and free childcare. He was adamant then that he had fully funded those commitments. His allocation today, then, of over £30 million of capital and £12 million resource to local government to provide the funding required is welcome, but surely it is a straightforward admission that the commitments made in January were never, in fact, fully funded. As for the mitigation of welfare reform, to which the Cabinet Secretary has allocated £2 million today, this is the day, April the 1st, by which he promised to have a scheme in place to fully mitigate the bedroom tax through discretionary housing payments or otherwise. At the weekend, UK ministers indicated that they would indeed allow such a scheme through discretionary housing payments. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us, is this scheme we both agreed is so important fully in place today as promised?
Cabinet Secretary.
In relation to Ian Gray's two questions, in the approach to the implementation of childcare provisions, we always made it clear that there were capital costs that would be the subject of discussion with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. Those discussions are underway. I have set out in the statement today £31.2 million of capital support that will be available to local government to undertake the physical work that is required to provide for the expansion of childcare. And in relation to the revenue support for free school meals, the Government has listened carefully to the points put forward by local government, and what I would simply say to Mr Gray is that that is what happens when you work in partnership with your local authority colleagues. You listen to what they say and you respond where you can and where there is justification for the points put forward. Now, in relation to the point on discretionary housing payments, Mr Gray knows that I appreciate and value the dialogue that he and I had in the run-up to the budget process, along with his colleague Jackie Bailey, in relation to discretionary housing payments. And of course I welcomed the fact that the Labour Party supported the Government's budget. I made clear at that time that our preferred route for dealing with the implications of the bedroom tax was for the removal of the cap on discretionary housing payments applied by the United Kingdom Government. We have not to date been advised of by the UK Government that that has in fact been agreed. I saw the same media reports to which Mr Gray refers. The Deputy First Minister raised this issue at the Joint Ministerial Committee in London on Wednesday of last week, and we continue to await the outcome of those discussions within the UK Government. And a variety of helpful advice and input has been given to try to resolve that issue. And I hope we get to the conclusion that I would prefer that the cap is lifted and that we can implement the approach as the Government would prefer to do. I give Mr Gray the assurance, however, that we cannot go on waiting forever. And there are other proposals that we will consider if we are unable to secure clarity from the United Kingdom Government. But I remain optimistic that the UK Government will agree to the point that we have put to them on this issue.
Gavin Brown.
I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of his statement. If the Scottish Government's NPD promises are to be credible, they have to deliver on the ground today. Previously, they said for 13-14 they would deliver £330 million on the ground. That was revised downwards to £185 million. Can the Cabinet Secretary guarantee Parliament that at least £185 million was delivered on the ground in 13-14? In relation to the childcare expansion policies, he stated, and I think I've taken it down correctly, that we still don't understand the capital cost implications of childcare expansion. This was a policy announced months ago. If they don't understand the cost implications today, when does he envisage that the Scottish Government will understand the capital cost implications of that policy? And finally, where are the underspends that he referred to at the beginning of his statement?
Cabinet Secretary.
If I can say to Mr Brown that today we have £635 million of NPD expenditure that is currently in construction. It's currently in construction. We have a further £1.4 billion worth of projects that are in procurement or have entered development through the hub. So I hope that's sufficient reassurance to Mr Brown that the government's programme is taking its course. Now, Mr Brown knows, because we've been round the houses on this several times, many times before, that I've accepted that the government was optimistic about the timescale for the implementation of the NPD projects. It took longer than we anticipated. But surely now that this government has rescued the capital programme of Scotland from the swingeing cuts of the Conservative government, surely now, the Conservatives would accept that the government has done a good job by getting £635 million of work in construction, which would never have happened if the Conservatives had been responsible for the programme. Now, the second point was on the capital cost of childcare, and what I've also said before, what the Education Secretary said before, is that we have to work with our local authority partners to establish, and it literally is a facility-by-facility exercise, to be clear, where the extra capacity is required. Some facilities have got extra capacity that can accommodate children entering into nursery education because they've got surplus accommodation. Others will have to develop additional accommodation. And it is literally a case-by-case analysis, working again in partnership with our local authority colleagues to make sure we do that job properly. It will be resolved timorously, but we're putting in place the financial commitments to enable that to happen. And of course, if I turn the logic of Mr Brown's argument round, I think there was some logic in the statement, but if I turn it round, Mr Brown is essentially arguing that we shouldn't embark on these commitments unless we have in place all the available capacity to try to do these measures. And we are taking forward the steps to implement this across the country. And his final point on underspends, there's a level of underspend the government has to secure from its budget this year to carry forward to support budget provisions in 14-15. There is some additional underspend coming beyond that, which is coming in some of the energy programmes, which are not spending as strongly as I anticipated, and I've rehearsed again these arguments with the Finance Committee before, and Mr Brown knows the reasons why that's the case. It's the uncertainty over electricity market reform, and we will of course make the statement to Parliament towards the summer recess on the outturn position once all the information is clear and to hand.
Backbench members who wish to ask the Cabinet Secretary a question should press the request to speak button now. I'm going to call Jamie Hepburn, but can I give a reminder to all members that I expect one question. It should be short. I want as many people in as possible, and I also need to protect the debate that comes afterwards. Jamie Hepburn, followed by Jenny Mara.
Provide detail on the impact of loan funding from the UK Government, particularly how this affects the finances of the Scottish Government. Cabinet
Secretary.
If I picked up Mr Hepburn correctly, I didn't quite. If it's in relation to the financial transactions, financial transactions are essentially loans that are made available to the Scottish Government. They cannot be spent as core capital expenditure. So I, for example, cannot allocate financial transactions to projects that essentially would be that would become part of the responsibility of government. They have to be taken forward by third parties. They are, of course, repayable, and we are in negotiation with the United Kingdom about the government about the terms of the repayment of those financial transactions, which will take place over a number of years once the resources have been allocated and deployed.
Jenny Mara, followed by George Adam.
Presiding Officer, investment in the Wood Commission proposals is welcome. The consequentials in this area have come from an expansion of apprenticeship places by 100,000 in England. Can the Cabinet Secretary guarantee that this investment will provide additional apprenticeship places, and can he estimate how many?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we've of course got more significant commitments to apprenticeships, and much more significant commitments to apprenticeships than when we came to office. We inherited about 16,000 apprenticeship places in Scotland, and we're now up at 25,000. And I would be very confident that the 25,000 level of apprenticeships for 2013-14 will have been secured. The Government will look very carefully at how we can use the resources that are allocated to support the measures to assist young people into employment. We will consider very carefully how the modern apprenticeship programme can be expanded. We will consider the implementation of the Wood Commission, obviously in consort with Sir Ian Wood, whose final report we anticipate with enormous interest in May. I think it will be a transformational report of enormous value to Scotland. And of course, many of the initiatives that were announced in the United Kingdom Government's budget about, for example, support to employers to take on individuals already exist within Scotland. So it's a case of the UK Government catching up with the measures that we've taken here in Scotland already.
George Adam, to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me what has been the impact of the UK budget for Scottish airports, given it failed to go far enough on air passenger duty?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, clearly a lot of the optimism that existed that the Chancellor might acknowledge the significance of the impact of air passenger duty on Scottish airports was dashed as a consequence of the budget. The Chancellor, of course, did accept that air passenger duty was a factor that undermined the competitiveness of some transport connections, which is why he acted to revise that in relation to certain international destinations. I only wish he had had Scotland in his mind when he was taking those decisions about air passenger duty.
Jim Hume, followed by Liam MacLeod.
Thank you. We know that under his plans, people on low and middle income will pay more income tax. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand the disappointment that he has not gone far enough on childcare, as he could have matched the 40% provision in England for 2-year-olds? When is he going to do that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm afraid I try my best to keep up in Parliament, but I just didn't understand the first part of Mr Hume's question. So, and the second point is that surely, Mr Hume voted for the budget. He was a supporter of the government's budget. His leader, I'm awful sorry his leader's not here today, because his leader's always much nicer to me than Mr Hume is. Much more appreciative of what I try to do to support the government's agenda on childcare. And I'm sure if Mr Rennie had been here today, he would have been much more supportive of the government than Mr Hume has been.
Billy MacLeod, followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what support will be available for the area I represent, Dumfries and Galloway, which suffered disproportionately from both inland flooding and also by tidal storm surges which caused coastal damage at Port William, Dromore and Kirkcudbright, among other places?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Dumfries and Galloway Council had made representations to the Government about the severe impact, and I think we all saw the fact that disproportionately the Dumfries and Galloway area endured some significant impact of the tidal surges and the flooding examples over the winter period. The local authority approached me about these questions. I had a very constructive meeting with them on the subject, and I agreed to match fund to the tune of £500,000 the support that the Council looked to put in place to remedy the difficulties that they had experienced. So this will enable a £1 million worth of investment to be undertaken to try to remedy some of the challenges that are faced in Dumfries and Galloway.
Ken McIntosh, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Under the NPD programme, not all the funding for schools, colleges or health facilities comes directly from the Scottish Government and so is not included in its 5% cap. will he meet the request of the Auditor-General and tell Parliament exactly what is included in the 5% cap and tell us how he's going to report on that to the Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think I've given a pretty comprehensive explanation of what is the methodology behind the 5% cap. I've given that information to Parliament. It's set out very clearly what's in the cap. It's an element of what I would have thought across the chamber would have been viewed to be valuable fiscal discipline, in contrast to the recklessness of the PFI commitments that I inherited when I came to office in 2007, where the costs were just galloping off and nobody had given a minute's thought to what type of constraints should be applied. So I think the mechanisms and the methodology is well explained to Parliament, and the Government is operating within the 5% cap that we volunteered to set to provide fiscal discipline to the Parliament.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Michael McMahon. Can
I welcome the additional £1 million for welfare reform mitigation? Can the Cabinet Secretary advise how he anticipates that will be allocated? And would he also agree that it would be far better if we had the powers here to shape and transform our welfare state, rather than have to mitigate the decisions that are taken at Westminster?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Government is looking carefully at some of the emerging issues on welfare reform. The Deputy First Minister is considering those priorities, and we are in discussion about how those can be best deployed in the coming period. And of course, further information will be set out to explain exactly how the support can be used to maximum effect to assist those who are suffering from the anxiety that is caused by the welfare reform programme.
Michael McMahon, followed by Patrick Harvie.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, the £1 million for welfare funding will be welcomed in general by the third sector, but it has been brought to my attention that there is a welfare reform capacity building fund which has been set up at around £2.5 million, and it has been expressed to me that the £1 million may have been better used and utilised had it been added to that fund to build capacity for those who are actually engaged in support and advice. Can the Cabinet Secretary offer an explanation as to why the money was chosen to be spent directly towards advice services and not to top up the welfare fund that's been created to support capacity?
Cabinet Secretary.
With the way I've expressed that, I may have misled Mr McMahon, but I certainly wasn't making an announcement that there would be £1 million going directly to advice services. The option and possibility that he has raised will certainly be considered as part of the proposals that the Deputy First Minister looks at, which was covered really by my response to Mr MacDonald, that we will make further announcements in due course. But I hear clearly what Mr McMahon has said, and the Deputy First Minister has heard it likewise.
Patrick Harvie, followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you. Isn't it the case that the Treasury figures quoted by the Cabinet Secretary, showing that the poorest households are particularly unfairly hit by the austerity cuts, underline the argument not only for the powers but also for the political will to develop a more progressive tax system where high-income individuals, like all of us in this chamber, as well as wealthy corporations who have enjoyed corporate tax cuts for too many decades already, begin to pay their way in society?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think what the Government is interested in doing is taking forward an agenda that makes Scotland more prosperous as a country and which tackles the inequality that exists within our society. Those are the principles that underpin the Government's programme. They underpin our aspirations to be an independent government that can exercise the type of responsibility to make other choices and to ensure that we live up to those principles of securing a more progressive society, a more progressive and prosperous society, and a fairer society into the bargain. And that is exactly what the Scottish Government will do.
Mike Mackenzie, followed by Gil Patterson.
The UK budget showed that Westminster has once again failed to deliver for Scotland. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm what changes we could make in terms of creating opportunities and securing investment if Scotland was independent?
Can we keep ourselves to your statement, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, clearly there would be a great deal more flexibility than I am able to exercise within the powers and responsibilities available to me under the devolved settlement, Presiding Officer, if Scotland was independent. But what I have tried to do in my statement today is to maximise the flexibility that is available to me and to maximise the impact of the spending that I have at my disposal.
Gil Patterson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Has the SNP government any plans to charge a £10 per month health tax on the sick as proposed by Labour?
Cabinet Secretary, it doesn't. Cabinet Secretary, it does not refer to your statement in any shape or form. So I'd appreciate it if you don't even attempt to answer it. We move to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney. We move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 9547 in the names of Hamza Yousaf on Scotland, a good global citizen. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak buttons now. And can I say to members that I have allowed that statement to run on because of the importance of it, but that does have implications for the debate that comes afterwards. We will monitor the debate throughout, but what is clear at this moment is that you need to keep to the time limits you'll be given. There is no time for paying back if you take interventions, and it's likely that at least one of the members who have requested to speak will not be able to. So can I call on Hamza Yousaf to speak to move the motion? Mr Yousaf, you have 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a great pleasure to lead this debate and to move the motion in the Parliament today. I welcome the opportunity to highlight the work of the Scottish Government and Scots more widely in areas of global concern, and to look at areas where Scots might contribute and where Scotland might contribute in this agenda further into the future. I had the great pleasure yesterday, Presiding Officer, of addressing and taking questions from the first ever Scottish Malawi Youth Congress organised by the Scottish Malawi Partnership. Speaking in this chamber can often be daunting at the best of times, but having to address over 100 teenagers from high schools across Scotland certainly wasn't for the faint-hearted. But it was very clear from their enthusiasm, from their questions, that our future in terms of this global agenda, important and global agenda, is in very good hands indeed. In Scotland we are, Presiding Officer, rightly proud of being an outward-looking nation, embracing the world beyond our borders, but also having our borders embraced by many who have travelled to make Scotland their home. Our Parliament is a great reflection of that. I've heard many stories from many members of this Parliament on how their families came to be in Scotland, from Jackie Bailey, Michael McMahon, Hanzala Malik, Christian Allard, and indeed myself and many others have spoken of that. The past 12 months we've been celebrating the life of Dr David Livingstone, the bicentenary of Dr David Livingstone, one of Scotland's greatest explorers, travellers, who embodied that thirst for education, enterprise and capacity for endurance. He made a significant contribution to our understanding of the world, but also, indeed, he's noted for his importance to civilization. Indeed, that's one of the 3 C's that are often talked about in regards to Dr David Livingstone. Talks about Christianity, commerce and civilization. That last one, civilization, the common bond that unites humanity in order to face down the challenges that concern us all, regardless of what religion, race or country it is that you come from. That spirit of global humanity or civilization, as Dr David Livingstone talked about, continues very much today. Scots play a huge role in international humanitarian organisations across the world, often in the most dangerous of circumstances. The Robert Burns Humanitarian Awards, which Scottish Government Ministers, the Cabinet Secretary has been at before, and myself, recognise the efforts of those brave Scots. And in particular, the 2 that I think about when it comes to the Robert Burns Humanitarian Awards have been individuals like Linda Norgrove and Khalil Dale, both of those who gave the ultimate sacrifice and were killed, sadly, tragically, while helping others to undertake their humanitarian work overseas. So I pay tribute to those Scots, but the many others, the thousands that are working across the world in the fight against global poverty. In terms of what the Scottish Government is currently doing, we have, as is known, an International Development Fund. Began in 2005 with a £3 million budget for Malawi, reflecting on those historic, but also indeed the modern civil society links between our 2 countries. I've spoken many a time for my great admiration and personal drive that Lord McConnell took that work forward with, and credit certainly where it is due that it is important that relationship was re-established, and I'm pleased that this government has chosen to build upon that work. I actually recently met Lord McConnell at the McConnell Foundation launch, where they were giving out certificates, but also actually announcing the scholarships for the volunteers for the next tranche of young children to go over to Malawi to get that life-changing experience. And there I clearly saw that the motivation that Lord McConnell had, the drive, the passion for Malawi hadn't left him. But I noted to him at that time he can now do it without a tie on, to which he replied, without any funny kilts either. And that was exactly what he said. So that relationship with Malawi remains extraordinarily special. And the uniqueness of it is that it's a very bottom-up relationship, and it's a partnership, and it's a reciprocal relationship. In 2007, this administration, when elected, looked to broaden that international development focus. Of course, it goes to four countries in sub-Saharan Africa now, not just Malawi, but Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia, and Rwanda, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia, and also 3 in South Asia, of course, 3 poorest states in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as well. The effect of our support on the lives of some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people is profound. It's something I saw firsthand myself in January of this year when I went for my first visit to the field in Malawi and Zambia. It was eye-opening being able to meet the local farmers just outside of Lusaka, who are partnered with SCIAF in order to learn sustainable agriculture, the difference that made to those livelihoods, the difference that our projects made to give energy to some of the poorest women in villages just outside of Blantyre. It was really a huge impact on me personally, but also to understand the importance of the international development work that we do that can so often be far removed. In addition to the international development work, Presiding Officer, we can be at our best in this field when we're very targeted and very focused in our efforts. A key element to our approach to international development is that we want to share Scotland's expertise, where we have those expertise and knowledge and technical expertise. We want to share them globally where we can in water and sanitisation, renewable energy, and indeed education. And I thought I'd touch very briefly on our climate change work and our climate justice work as an example of that. Our ambitious action to tackle climate change has been internationally recognised by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, who's praised Scotland's leadership on the climate change agenda and indeed our commitment to renewable energies, inviting Scotland himself personally to take part in the UN Sustainable Energy for All programme. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, former President of Ireland Mary Robinson, all full of praise for Scotland's championing of climate justice. In 2012, we launched that innovative climate justice fund, helping people in Malawi and Zambia adapt to the impacts of climate change. And at the Climate Justice Conference last year, in October, the First Minister announced a doubling of that fund. But I think the climate justice work is important, not just because it highlights our areas of expertise, but it's important, Presiding Officer, because Scotland's role as a good global citizen is not just about aid and it's not just about charity, but it's also very much about justice. And that's why we call it a Climate Justice Fund. Yes, the First Minister has said previously that it's a drop in the ocean in the fight against climate change. But it's an important step because this is not an issue just about aid or charity. It is because of our excesses in terms of using energy and so on and so forth that those in the global south and the developing world, they are the ones who are suffering the most. So it's about rebalancing that injustice that exists. Presiding Officer, I've also mentioned earlier that Scots have been great travellers and explorers. However, we are perceived as a nation on the global stage as much by our domestic policy in any country as by its domestic policy as much as it is in terms of what it chooses to do internationally. And so we have a commitment, we have an obligation, in fact, to be a good global citizen by setting example through domestic policy. We're committed to creating a modern and inclusive Scotland which protects and respects and realises, of course, human rights. We expect all states to comply with international and human rights law and condemn, of course, human rights abuses wherever they occur. We can encourage change through example. In that vein, the Commonwealth Games, Homecoming and the Ryder Cup give us huge opportunities. We will have, of course I will.
Travis Scott.
Encouraging change around the world. Would you look forward to meeting the Dalai Lama at some stage?
Minister.
I haven't had the invitation to meet with the Dalai Lama, but of course, if that invitation comes, it will be considered, because when it comes to any country, be it China, and in fact the Cabinet Secretary herself has raised the issue of human rights with the Chinese. I have raised it, of course, when I went to China myself, but wherever it is that we go, we look to do that. And so certainly, if Tavish Scott would like to forward an invitation, that would, all invitations are considered by their merit. But the point is that with Commonwealth Games, the Ryder Cup and Homecoming, we have a huge opportunity to make sure that international human rights is at the centre. At the forthcoming Commonwealth Games, people will be left in no doubt, athletes, officials, those that are watching, of Scotland's values and commitment to human rights. They will be the heart of the Games. Looking ahead, Presiding Officer, I've highlighted some of the key areas in which Scotland is currently demonstrating a commitment to international cooperation and doing what she can in the fight against global poverty. But my belief, of course, is that we could do so much more, be that with the powers of independence, of course. It would mean that for the first time in 300 years, and over 300 years, Scotland's interest will be directly represented on the international stage. Independence presents a unique opportunity to put Scotland's interests first. Important because the choices that we make internationally will have a significant impact on our economy, society and people, but also countless thousands, if not millions, worldwide also. On international development and the future, I'd like to say from the offset that I very much, of course, respect the commitment and the hard work demonstrated by those at DFID and indeed by the Department as a whole. I also have said many a time in this chamber that I welcome the UK Government's reaching the UK 0.7 UN target for overseas aid in terms of GNI. It's certainly better late than never, and I continue to urge the Prime Minister to follow through with his government's promise to enshrine that target in legislation and not heed the voices of opposition, be they from his own backbenches or otherwise. But with independence, Scotland, we have the opportunity to create a fairer and more progressive international development policy. On page 230 of our Scotland's Future, we explain some of those priorities. We would have a more and better aid system. 0.7% would be legislated as a target. So we'd future-proof it for governments. We have mentioned that we would look towards the issue of debt relief. The Scottish Government will give careful consideration to the issue of debt relief. We will work to ensure that an independent Scotland Export Agency does not create new unjust debt. We put gender equality, and we'll look to put gender equality at the heart of our international development policy should we have control over that important function, because every study shows that in international development, gender equality, you'll get more bang for your development buck. And also one of the most important issues that we'll look to develop in regards to independence and international development will be the idea of do no harm, this idea of policy coherence for development, which NIDOS, the Network for International Development Organisations in Scotland, have been championing for quite a while now, and a lot of their conferences have been focusing on this idea that we shouldn't undermine the good work that we do with international development through our trade policies, through our foreign policy, and so on and so forth. On foreign policy, Presiding Officer, we'd like Scotland to be known as a nation that promotes peace, one that leaves a positive influence on the global stage, and what an opportunity we have to do that, and what a great signal it would send to the world that upon a yes vote, that Scotland will safely and responsibly remove the abhorrence of nuclear Trident missiles from our soil. That will send a strong message to the international community about the progressive beacon that we aim to be in the world. That will only be strengthened by our values being enshrined, of course, within our written constitution, but also in terms of foreign policy. We'll have that essential triple lock, which is talked about in the White Paper, that military intervention will be internationally legal, sanctioned by the Scottish Government and, of course, sanctioned by this Parliament. So never again, Presiding Officer, will our sons and daughters have to fight in an illegal war that was based on the premise of a lie. The importance of the Parliament is seen indeed in the international development work that we do. It's demonstrated by our parliamentarians, by our cross-party groups, and is very rightly highlighted by Patricia Ferguson in her amendment. I'm pleased to say that we will be supporting it on that basis. Presiding Officer, the First Minister set out last year his aspiration that an independent Scotland would be a progressive beacon. We envisage a Scotland that encompasses our core values, acting as a good global citizen and contributing to the international community. I very much look forward to the discussions today, hearing from other members about their future vision of how an independent Scotland, regardless of what they believe the constitutional setup should be, will play its role as a good global citizen on the world stage.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Patricia Ferguson to speak to move amendment number 9547.3. Ms Ferguson, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. In this fast-changing world, one thing remains constant, and that is the responsibility which wealthy, developed countries such as ours have to support our friends and colleagues in developing countries across the world. And I was interested that the Minister chose to begin by talking about David Livingstone, because David Livingstone was a great Scot. He was a great humanitarian, he was a great doctor and, of course, a missionary. And sadly, David Livingstone died from many of the tropical diseases that he was instrumental in identifying and naming in the first instance. And the sadness of that is that today, so many years after his death, many of those tropical diseases are still prevalent and are still killing people around the world. And for some of them, we really don't even have a cure. So the legacy that David Livingstone left us must surely be that we redouble our efforts to try to combat the plague of those diseases. But because we believe so much in international development, Labour supports the motion in the name of the Scottish Government, while seeking, we hope, to add some additional substance to it. And we would also have supported the amendment in the name of Tavish Scott, which helped to remind us of the history of international development in Scotland and the part played by successive Scottish administrations. It's also important that we recognise that climate change is a problem for every country in the world, but that ironically and sadly, those countries which have contributed least to issues like global warming are the ones that suffer most from the changes we see happening to the climate internationally. As we've heard, in 2005, a Labour and Liberal Democrat administration recognised that we had such a responsibility and decided that we would play our part in taking forward this vital agenda. We did this with the full support and encouragement of the UK Government, who saw it as a way to add value to the work they were already doing. We decided at that time that we would concentrate our efforts on Malawi, but I would have to say to the Minister, not exclusively Malawi. We targeted sub-Saharan Africa. But Malawi was very important and central to our plans because we felt that there was a responsibility there both to cement our age-old ties of friendship and to work with the Government of Malawi to ensure that we supported their priorities for their country. But one of the most important elements of our approach was a determination that it would be a partnership between two nations working together and not a relationship between donor and recipient. And in taking forward this work, as the amendment in my name states, we were simply building on the efforts of the many schools, churches, colleges, local authorities, communities and NGOs who already had their own relationships with counterparts in Malawi and who had already helped to make real change in the lives of so many Malawians. And Parliament too, over the years, has played its part by helping to develop the skills of Malawian parliamentary clerks and parliamentarians, with a number of our members of this Parliament going to Malawi to conduct workshops with our colleagues there. A number of cross-party groups have also been established to promote interest and activity in Malawi and in other countries with which we have a relationship. But I think it's important to remember that the work we do should complement the work the UK does through DFID, and that it is vital that we maintain a good relationship with DFID and align our work with theirs so that we maximise the value of our activity and avoid duplicating effort. And we should be very proud that DFID is based in East Kilbride and value both the work done there and the jobs that are located in Scotland as a result. And one does have to wonder what would happen to those jobs were we to separate from the UK. Now, I'm happy to.
Christina McKelvey. Can I thank Patricia Ferguson for taking an intervention and wonder if she has spoken to any of the staff members, especially PCS members, who work in that office and who all voted recently to support the Yes campaign? Patricia Ferguson.
People will vote as people think is fit, and I do note that PCS has actually chosen as a union to remain neutral in the issue, which is probably a good thing from their point of view. But I have to say that if you think about the position of the staff whether to be a yes vote, I think the reality might make them regret any decision that they may have made in that direction. But we began this work at a time when there was real momentum around development because of the G8 summit at Gleneagles. And we discuss these issues today at a time when we are facing up to the fact that a number of the Millennium Development Goals will not be met before they expire in 2015. However, we shouldn't be despondent about this, but must instead play an active part in developing a new framework. In a world where 22% of the world's population live on less than $1.25 a day, and where 1 in 8 people around the world go hungry, it is vital that we continue to work on these issues and look for every opportunity to make a difference. As the second nation to be granted Fair Trade Nation status, we can be proud of the work that has gone on around our country to increase the number of fairly traded products on sale and to raise awareness of fair trade. But we need to go further, because too often we hear horror stories about the pay and conditions of workers in garment and other factories and the work that they experience there. Too often we hear of tragedies that occur because of those conditions. And the worst of it is that they are producing garments for us to buy cheaply here. Too often our desire to find a bargain blinds us to the reality of the origins of our purchases. They may be cheap to us, but others pay a high price to produce them for us. Now, we on this side of the chamber support the idea of a procurement bill, but we think that the current bill doesn't go far enough, which will come as no surprise to the chamber. We want to see sustainable procurement become the norm. We want to see this legislation as a vehicle that ensures workers are paid a living wage. And we believe that companies benefiting from public sector contracts should pay tax at a fair rate so that money can be reinvested in our communities. And, Presiding Officer, we would back a Robin Hood tax on transactions too. Now, many of our agencies at the moment are promoting the idea of policy coherence, where they encourage government to consider carefully all its actions to ensure that policies are not contradictory and that our support for developing nations extends into every policy area by making all our policies compatible with that aim. Scottish Labour believes that this is an entirely reasonable suggestion and one that we would like to work with those agencies to develop. Taking forward that idea, we would like to see the Scottish Government being more proactive in challenging governments they have a relationship with on their human rights records. Whether it's the way China treats dissidents or the dangers that gay people face in Uganda, we have to challenge the thinking that allows this to happen. And we have to, all of us, be a critical friend if our own commitment to human rights is to mean anything at all. And policy coherence must allow us to be that critical friend if it is to be worth doing. Now, I don't think that policy coherence will necessarily be an easy thing to do. I think it will be extremely challenging, but I think it is something that we should look at very seriously and something that we would do well to consider and discuss with our colleagues in the international development world. But I also want to mention just briefly, Presiding Officer, before I come to a close, the work that has also been done by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association in this Parliament, and as a member of the branch executive, it would probably be remiss of me not to mention that, because over the years we have worked with our colleagues in the corporate body to try to make sure that the schemes we've been able to put in place to encourage young parliamentarians from Malawi and other countries and to encourage their parliamentary clerks to take forward the work that they do in a way that will help them to build the openness and transparency in their countries that they seek and that they work very, very hard to establish. And I think that work has been very valuable indeed. A recent initiative of the CPA International is to have a mentoring project where MSPs or others from other parliaments can work with an individual from the developing world to encourage and to help them through their work as an elected politician. I think that's something that goes very much to the heart of the partnership that we sought to establish back in 2005 with Malawi. because our relationship with the developing world must be one where we work with people in the developing world and with governments in the developing world, so that we do have a relationship of partners and equals, because only by doing that will we truly live up to our reputation that we want to have as a global citizen. And surely that is indeed what we all want to be known for.
Many thanks. I now call on Jackson Carlaw to speak to and to move amendment to 9547.1, maximum 6 minutes.
Presiding officer, I was told by one much valued SNP colleague of an invariably sunny disposition earlier today that mine was the only amendment that wasn't consensual, and I was, of course, astonished about the amendment, which I now move in my own name, presiding officer, because it seems to me wholly consensual to, of course, suggest that the people of Scotland benefit from the UK's international networks and influence on the world stage. All of us in this chamber are, of course, immensely proud of the work the people of Scotland do on international development, furthering the campaign to eliminate global poverty, championing climate justice, but it cannot be denied that by being a part of the larger UK family, we add to our domestic efforts and we achieve so much more. Our UK diplomatic network extends across 250 countries, protecting our citizens abroad, promoting our interests. Our UK Trade and Investment Agency works internationally in over 100 countries to promote the economic interests of businesses based in Scotland, as well as those in England and elsewhere. Our Department for International Development, which has been mentioned repeatedly already, leads the UK's work to end extreme poverty, working to end the need for aid by creating jobs, unlocking the potential of girls and women, helping to save lives when humanitarian emergencies hit. The UK has played a leading role in strengthening the rule of law, supporting democracy and protecting human rights around the world. From the historical campaign to end the slave trade all those centuries ago, drafting the European Convention on Human Rights in the 50s, supporting the creation of a UN Human Rights Council in 2006, in a moment, as well as using the UK's presidency of the G8 in 2013 to launch an initiative on preventing sexual violence. Scots have been at the heart of most, if not all, of this.
Stuart Stevenson.
It may have been a slip of the tongue. I heard the member say that the UK has embassies in 250 countries. Would he care to give us the names of 3 beyond the 198 members of the United Nations?
Jackson Carlaw.
I'm sure that I'd love to be on Mastermind with Mr Stevenson, because it would be almost impossible to compete against such a wealth of knowledge on all subjects. And I once again pay tribute to the vast reach of his interests and erudition. He said with mock sincerity. The Prime Minister also put tackling tax avoidance at the top of the G8 agenda. Large companies who are avoiding paying taxes are depriving developing countries of the funds necessary to implement food security measures. It was also announced last year that some of the international aid budget will be diverted to provide stabilisation forces in fragile states. This is not only the right thing to do, but it's in our UK or even Scottish national interest. There is no development without security, and we know that instability overseas means very often we eventually foot a larger bill here in the UK in mitigation. Our UK takes a leading role on the... Yes, of course.
Question on that front. Is he, through his remarks, then suggesting that aid money should be spent on military intervention? As has been securitisation of aid?
No, and in fact, I'm going to come to an example of how Scotland actually prevented military intervention in just a moment. Our UK takes a leading role in the fight against poverty as the world's second largest aid donor and was the first G8 country to spend 0.7%, which the Minister graciously acknowledged, of gross national income on aid from 2013. Our UK is helping children to go to school, immunising millions of children against preventable diseases, saving the lives of tens of thousands of women in pregnancy and childbirth and hundreds of thousands of newborn babes. And I endorse and applaud all Mr Youssef said, and that which was subsequently said by Patricia Ferguson about Scotland's role in Malawi and elsewhere. And I support and appreciate his sincere efforts on behalf of Scotland in that work. The UK has provided assistance in Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the tsunami and in Lebanon, where it evacuated over 4,000 UK entitled people in just 6 days. But I touched on Syria, and I want to return to that, because in last year's crisis over Syria, Scotland was deeply influential. In the vote in the House of Commons, which took place on military action, that decision not to proceed militarily was taken by a majority of just 13. That 13 included the votes of 45 Scottish MPs who voted no. It was Scotland, voting through the United Kingdom, that stopped military action in Syria, and it was Scotland through the United Kingdom that caused the United States to pause in its consideration of military action, and as a result to approach the whole Syrian crisis in a different way. There could not be a better example of how Scotland, through the United Kingdom, exercised influence on a major international incident which led to a change in the way the international community responded to that. That simply would not have been the case had Scotland stood alone and not been part of the United Kingdom. It's a practical and demonstrable point. And there are now 9.3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Syria, including 6.5 million internally displaced people inside Syria and 2.4 million Syrian refugees in neighbouring countries. The UK has pledged £600 million to provide support, including food, medical care and relief items for over 1 million people in Syria and the region, making it the UK's largest ever response to a humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian values are not something over which Scotland alone is a passion. They are shared by the people in the rest of the UK, and we can and we will and we must do more by remaining together. But since I was told I wasn't consensual when I started, let me conclude by saying we will support the Labour amendment, we would have supported the Liberal Democrat amendment, and we will support the government motion, amended or otherwise. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I turn to the open debate. We're extremely tight for time. Speeches of 6 minutes or less, and I might be able to call everyone. Christian Allard, to be followed by Siobhan McMahon.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Scotland is a good global citizen today, but this time from the country I come from, but this time from Westminster, and I have to find the Labour amendment to acknowledge this, that we have very much a distinct country. As someone who was not born in Scotland, I can testify that Scotland and the people of Scotland have a great tradition of being good global citizens. Citizens who understand the world we live in, and more importantly, citizens who know how to engage in equal footing with people across the globe. We recognise the importance of human rights, we respect international law, and we have a positive attitude towards refugees and how to fulfil our human rights obligations. This positive language is not often heard at Westminster today. Immigration, climate change and the international rule of law are used as arguments to disengage the UK from its international obligations. Some blame the media. I don't, Presiding Officer. I blame the Westminster culture, a culture from politicians which is very distinct from our own culture in this Parliament, and a culture from politicians who have their own axis to grind. They really ought to know better. Members today will have to decide which direction they would want Scotland to take. The direction that this Parliament has taken since it reconvened in 1999, or the direction successive governments at Westminster are taking the UK towards. Within the limited powers that we have, I think we have punched well above our weight since 1999 and since 2005, and the people of Scotland have been supporting our highly successful programme of international development work, delivering real and tangible outcomes on the ground. What I like about our involvement is that it isn't driven by our national commercial interests or by some political or military alliance with other national governments, and nor should it be. Our involvement is driven by our desire to alleviate poverty in the world where it is the most needed, using existing partners and NGOs like Oxfam Scotland. As one of the wealthiest nations in the world, we recognise that we have a responsibility to international development. I believe we can do more, much more, ensuring that Scotland's aid is of the highest quality. One of the best examples of this new approach is our innovative Climate Justice Fund, recognised and supported across the world. Like the Minister said at his launch, Mary Robinson, President of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, said, Scotland Climate Justice Fund acknowledges that those who contributed least to the causes of climate change are bearing the brunt of its impacts. Others said that championing climate justice is crucial in promoting human rights across the world, adding to the vital work to improve access to education and health. Building trust between developed and developing countries must transcend any concern some nation might have about immigration and the right of refugees. I have met refugees from many countries, Presiding Officer, and we all recognised our distinct approach to human rights that we have here in Scotland. This approach can only be boosted by this nation becoming independent, and I'm looking forward to show how Scotland can become a better global citizen after September. Asylum seekers are fleeing persecution or serious harm in their own country. They often arrive in this country in which they claim asylum by chance and with little forethought or preparation. Scotland will play a responsible role as a good global citizen, supporting vulnerable people fleeing persecution. Migrants apply for visas to come to Scotland to work, study or to join family members here. Like me, they made a decision to move to Scotland. As a EU citizen, I did not need a visa to come here and to make my life. Our policy is clear, and independent Scotland will continue as a member of the EU. This has been recognised by others with no access to grind. Some who came here from the EU the past few months, from the French Senate and from the French Assemblée Nationale, politicians came here and backed up our position because it is common sense. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by quoting some of the recent articles in the media on the issue of the two futures that are in the front of us. Last Sunday, the front page of a paper invited us to know more about Generation Yes. You might have bought it. But inside, I read a couple of columns from another voice. Alison Doig is telling us about the great work the Scottish Government is doing in Malawi, and our investments in London are going on the opposition direction. On the same page, Ian McColm is giving us his own perspective on the prospect of a written constitution after a yes vote. The stuff, he wrote, the stuff of the European Convention on Human Rights doesn't need to be written down again. He added, a written constitution that guaranteed certain matters of policy would be a terrible and democratic development. I have a message from Ian McColm. I don't believe that being Scottish makes us different from others. But I do know the difference between our Parliament and a Parliament in London that uses a negative tone to disengage from its international obligations. Mr McColm, I do not believe in Scottish exceptionalism, but I believe that Scotland can play a full role working with and alongside the international community on migration, climate change and the international rule of law. We will communicate with rather than dictate to the international community. The UK is the only country of the European Union or the Commonwealth that does not have a written constitution or a constitution act. That is a democratic deficit, and independent Scotland will not replicate.
Could you close, please? As
a member of the World Parliament for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Group, PNND, I would like to make my own contribution for a nuclear weapons-free Scotland in the constitution of an independent Scotland.
I'm afraid I have to reiterate that there's no time in this debate to go over your time, and if members do that, then a member will fall out of the debate. Siobhan McMahon, to be followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be able to take part in this afternoon's debate, particularly as it's taking place during the Christian season of Lent. As most of you, if not all of you, will know, Lent is where Christians remember and reflect on the time when Jesus spent 40 days and nights fasting in the desert whilst being tempted by the devil. Most of us will observe the season by giving something we enjoy up for that period. Given it's nearly 4 weeks into the season, the majority of us observing Lent will be struggling to keep our promises. I know I am. However, with only a couple of weeks to go, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. For so many others in less fortunate parts of the world, they have to go without the most basic of things on a day-to-day basis. For them, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. That is why I welcome the chance to participate in today's debate. It is right that we recognise the proud record Scotland has in relation to international development and reflect on the things we have been good at, but also highlight the things we can get better at. I will, of course, be supporting the Labour amendment tonight, which rightly recognises the invaluable contribution individuals and aid organisations throughout Scotland make to international development, as without them we wouldn't have made as much of a difference as we would have liked. Last week, Sarah Boyack and myself hosted a SCIAF event entitled Taking Care of Business. It was a chance for MSPs and guests to meet with and hear from SCIAF and their partners from Colombia who were in attendance about the impact big business is having on the country's Afro-Caribbean and Indigenous communities. The event included presentations from representatives of the Indigenous Embera community and Caritas Colombia. We heard from Monsignor Hector Fabio, who coordinates a network of offices throughout Colombia that work in peace building, human rights and providing assistance to victims of the Colombian conflict. In December 2003, he led the negotiations which led to the release of foreign tourists held hostage by the ELN guerrillas. In 2012, he received the Liberty Medal from the Mexican Embassy in Colombia in recognition of his work towards strengthening democracy and human rights in Colombia. Monsignor Hector Fabio was joined by Father Sterling and Criseria Chami. Criseria belongs to the Embera community. Her community has experienced the negative impact of various external actors encroaching on their territory, including illegal armed actors and rich landowners keen to expand their cattle ranches. Criseria and her family are featured on the SCIAF's Wee Box this year. This was the first time somebody featured in the Wee Box has visited Scotland during Lent. For those of us in attendance, you could not be failed to be moved when hearing the personal testimonies of these three speakers as they told us about the impacts of big business on their community. To be clear, the business they spoke about was those registered in the UK and Scotland, and not business specifically registered in Colombia. That is why I agree with SCIAF in calling for a coherent approach to tackling global poverty, the type of poverty experienced by Criseria and her community. In order to tackle examples like this, we cannot simply rely on aid agreements that we already have in place. As SCIAF stated in the briefing for today, a policy coherence approach must be at the heart of Scotland's role as a global citizen, with policy decisions across the whole of government being made coherently through a development lens. I couldn't agree more, and I believe that the procurement bill currently making its way through Parliament gives us an excellent opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to this proposal. I hope that this is something the Scottish Government can support. It will come as no surprise to the Minister that I will speak about Malawi in today's debate. I've spoken about many aspects of my visit to Malawi on a number of occasions in this chamber. However, I have never addressed the human rights issue that are apparent in the country. That is something I'm extremely concerned about, and I believe Scotland and the Scottish Government could be doing something more in regards to this. During my visit to Malawi, I visited two prisons, Chichiri and Zomba. Although the conditions for all prisoners are horrendous, for female prisoners they are inhumane. Despite the efforts of charities and individuals, no more so than Sister Anna Tomasi, the conditions are only getting worse for these women. I witnessed 40 women and children sharing one cell. They had to sleep on the floor with no bedding, and they had to take a shower 3 at a time. I spoke with a woman who was 74 and had been in prison for over 20 years without trial. She wasn't a one-off. This is the norm. As you can imagine, living in conditions like this have a considerable effect on her health. However, the females of the prison don't have access to the prison hospital. That is reserved for the males. An Amnesty International review of Malawi in 2011 showed that prisons were overcrowded. The prison system, with a capacity of 6,000, was holding around 13,000 prisoners. Prison congestion was exacerbated by prolonged pre-trial detention. Overcrowding, poor nutrition, poor sanitation, inadequate health facilities contributed to the spread of infections, including tuberculosis and measles. Many prisoners relied on families and charities for supplementary food. In Chichiri prison in June, prisoners were locked in overcrowded communal cells with poor ventilation and had to sleep sitting up. Up to 200 prisoners shared one toilet. One inmate had been held for 9 years without trial. He was later released on bail. The female section of Chichiri prison was similarly congested. 8 of the 55 female prisoners were mothers with babies. Further to this, a report on the monitoring of prisons in Malawi by the Malawi Human Rights Commission for the period between December 2011 and March 2012 revealed that 79 prisoners had died. It is clear that human rights are continuously being breached in Malawi. I know of the important work that many organisations, including churches and schools throughout Scotland, continue to carry out in the country, and I would never wish for this to stop. The invaluable amount of aid that has been sent to the country by this Scottish Government cannot be underestimated, and this must continue. But I wonder if we could be stronger in our agreement with the country. We cannot allow the conditions that I have just outlined to persist. We must do more, not to the detriment of others, but to the benefit of all citizens of Malawi. That is our duty as international partners, and we truly reflect the laudable aim of Scotland being a good global citizen.
Thank you. I call Christina McKelvey to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Global citizenship is a big idea, a big concept, and so sometimes difficult to pin down. You can perhaps define it more clearly by putting forward its antonym, its opposite, alienation and isolation. Ideas and ways of living that cut out the rest of the world. That can be deliberate. The splendid isolation of 19th century UK Tory Prime Minister's foreign policy in Europe is coming full circle 20 years on, regaining its popularity at Westminster. Or it may be the kind of isolation that is forced upon countries in conflict, as Syria or Sudan are experiencing.
And it can be the isolation and alienation that leaves our young people feeling lost and powerless, deprived of a future, feeling that society has let them down and offered them nothing positive. So Global Citizen is not some kind of benevolence bestowed upon the poor by wealthy do-gooders seeking to salve their own consciences. It's about interdependence, participation, taking responsibility. No economy is isolated from global economic conditions, and every nation is increasingly dependent to a greater or lesser degree on the flow of international trade and investment and its relationships with others. Yet as things stand, we can do little. The Scotland Act tells us we are responsible for observing international obligations under the Human Rights Convention and obligations under EU law that can assist UK ministers in relation to issues of foreign affairs. One of our colleagues recently tried to assist by filling in for a missing UK Environment Minister in Doha. He was refused and the chair was left empty. That's how we are able to assist UK ministers. We have no formal voice on the international stage. We saw that very clearly in the Iraq War. We are seeing it now in relationships with the rest of the EU. And in independent Scotland, we can put forward our views. And we have a choice at the leading world discussion fora, political, civil or across the international opinion-forming organisations of human rights, academia, international aid and disaster relief, for example. Independence will give us the power to do things differently. Instead of projecting the isolationist agenda that has taken over in Westminster, we will be directing our international efforts into deepening and consolidating relationships with friends and partners, new and old, across the world, and through this, expanding opportunities for people and business in Scotland. Our bywords will be cooperation, development and trade. Our clear priorities will be commerce and partnership, not conflict. Scotland will be a champion for international justice and peace. And you only need to look at the Scottish Government's country plans to see the aspirations we have with our friends across the world. Though restrained by Westminster command that we may only assist Ministers of the Crown, we in Scotland have been very much engaged with international development policy. And we talk about Malawi, and we're very, very proud of the work we do in Malawi. I'm very, very proud to come from a part of Lanarkshire that remembers David Livingstone. But I have to say, when I met the kids in Bandaway Primary School in Malawi, they seemed to know much more about David Livingstone than I did. And I have to say and congratulate Siobhan McMahon on a very, very powerful speech. We should always be proud about the work we do in Malawi, but we should never forget when there is injustice, and we should stand up for that all the time. Very powerful indeed. Since the International Development Policy set out in 2008, we've been working to enhance Scotland's contribution to the global fight against poverty and have created an International Development Fund which has now grown to £9 million a year. The fund focuses on 7 countries: Bangladesh, India, Malawi, Pakistan, Rwanda, Tanzania and Zambia. And notably, as we've all mentioned today, Malawi, which has received around half of the funding. And of course, we have made that promise that an independent Scotland will enshrine in law a spend of at least 0.7% of our gross national income on development aid. It is our values as a nation that will drive meaningful, effective aid, and as a small, wealthy country, we can monitor and check just how our support is being used to improve the lives of others beyond our shores. Something I found very compelling when I was in Malawi, the work that is being done. Money not channelled through governments, but channelled directly to the people that need it. To those seeking sanctuary in Scotland, an ethical foreign policy and a nuclear-free, peaceful nation, these will be our cornerstones internationally. Eliminating poverty, as Mandela said, is not an act of charity, but of justice. That concept of fairness for all will be a keystone in our society. By playing a meaningful part in world problems like human trafficking, climate change, hunger, clean water, sanitation, unjust debt, healthcare, education and gender equality is a major responsibility, and one that our own children, especially my young son, are developing through the Curriculum for Excellence and the work that he is doing on global citizenship. Global citizenship means accepting the need for change, and it means the capacity to help and deliver that change. So let us go forward in an independent Scotland and deliver a contribution that does no less than change the lives of people we care for the better. We all have the right to justice. Whatever we are in the world and wherever we are in the world, we have that right. but we all have an obligation to be good global citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tavish Scott, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to speak to the first part of the Minister's motion this afternoon on international cooperation in areas of global concern. I also reread the Independent's White Paper that he mentioned in his opening remarks to understand the SNP's policy positions. And I do hope in passing that the Minister might support Mr Carlo's amendment today, given his evidence to the Westminster International Development Committee on the 31st of October. To his credit, the Minister was fulsome in his praise of the UK international aid work. I commend that evidence to his own backbenchers. And I also particularly noted his remarks about the international development staff in East Kilbride and the points that Patricia Ferguson made earlier this afternoon. The biggest worldwide challenge is not the madness of North Korea or even the utterly depressing civil war in Syria, and I shared Mr Carlo's political assessment of what happened in London some months back on that. It is what is unfolding here in Europe. The crisis that is Eastern Europe is the foreign policy challenge of today. This is how to confront an assertive Russian president, a man who says what he wants and does it. This is about NATO's role, and that is important because of the SNP's position of joining the Nuclear Defence Alliance if Scotland is independent. The Eastern Europe of today is also about human rights, as the motion mentions. Putin released Pussy Riot just before the Sochi Winter Olympic Games, but then had them attacked in front of the TV cameras because they didn't do what he wanted them to do. The only supporter, ironically, of Putin in the UK today is the UKIP leader Nigel Farage. Farage cites Putin as the politician he most admires. Apparently, he appears more on Russia Today, Putin's in-house TV channel, than any other European politician. Now, most of us would find Putin's views odd, if not just downright dangerous. But that is why his views should receive the widest possible airing. And I think it's why the SNP were completely wrong to attack Farage when he was in Edinburgh last year. Holding signs saying "Go back to England" makes me uncomfortable about my country. Farage should have his say and be defeated on... Can I just finish the point, then I'll happily give way? Farage should have his say and then be defeated on the arguments, not be chased away by a rent-a-crowd. Happy to agree.
Minister.
I wonder, first of all, if Mr Scott and the member would be able to tell us one SNP member, of course, who was standing out there and attacking Farage. But secondly, that he spent 2 minutes basically defending Nigel Farage's rights in Scotland. I mean, it seems a bizarre tack to take the debate on.
Tavish Scott.
I think we live in a democracy, and any politician should be allowed to say what he wishes and have his arguments defeated if the SNP disagree with that. I, for example, rather enjoyed George Galloway and Brian Wilson the other night in Bathgate making arguments against independence. By the following of the Minister's remarks, they shouldn't be allowed to have that say either. Presiding Officer, the annexation of Crimea, they're very sensitive on this point. Do you notice that, how sensitive they are? You always know with the SNP you've got them on something. If they attack you, don't you?
I think, Mr Scott, if you could stop for a moment, I think that the members are probably wondering if you would return to the subject of a good global citizen. Thank you. And remember that you only have 6 minutes maximum.
Presiding Officer, I was here for the Minister's opening speech and he made a lot of remarks about independence, and that's what I'm addressing. The annexation of Crimea, the massing of Russian troops on Ukraine's border, the readiness to use military intervention means NATO's role in Europe is changing. Putin wants to force Ukraine apart using propaganda, agents of influence and provocateurs. His 18th of March announcement that Crimea is now Russian was steely in its vision. Russia will use military force in support of coercive diplomacy where it feels that Russian interests are jeopardised. So what then of the response? I don't know whether the Minister shares my views that the Western response to the annexation of Crimea hasn't been good enough. There is talk on economic sanctions, but tough, real measures would mean saying to BP, to Chevron, to Boeing and to Siemens that they cannot do business in Russia. No wonder action has so far been limited to naming and shaming just a small number of Russian diplomats. Here is where high-minded diplomacy competes with economic power. An independent Scotland would face exactly the same dilemma. An economy beholden to oil majors led by a First Minister with an appreciation of big international businessmen would make choices. And when it came to human rights, Minister, Alex Salmond chose China and not the Dalai Lama. By your deeds, your government will certainly be judged. The NATO Secretary-General said this morning that Russia had broken its international commitments and there will be a reassessment of NATO's defence plans. At this rate, Saxe-Fordinance will once again be a NATO listening station looking to the east. So it is therefore right to ask this government, who want to be members of NATO, what their position would be. What would their response be to a Russian president driving forward his doctrine of the Russian world, where Russian-speaking parts of Eastern Europe can be invaded? NATO meets in full session in Cardiff in September. Its 28 members must define and address Russia's recent record. In Transnistria, in South Ossetia, in Abkhazia and now in Crimea. NATO's Secretary-General was right this morning when speaking in Brussels. Russia has not once but many times rewritten international rules about the boundaries of sovereign countries. The Baltic states are most exposed. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia are NATO members. Were Russia to threaten annexation, NATO would be duty-bound to invoke Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all. So what is the Minister and his government's position? He cannot surely say this is a matter for Westminster on one hand and stand behind his white paper on the other. Being a member of NATO is a lot more than just an annual lunch and a photo opportunity. It is about committing men and women to the potential for armed conflict, the hardest decision that any leader must take. This is a crisis now. I'd be grateful if the Minister would share with us his view, given his talk of independence, as to what his government would actually do.
Many thanks. Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to spend most of my time talking about the impact that smaller countries can have in international affairs. Others have referred to Mary Robinson, and I very much commend the work of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. Their work is in 4 parts: sustainable energy, climate justice, food and nutrition, and gender impact. Sustainable energy is clearly one where Scotland has a set of engineering skills that would enable us to work on that agenda. Climate justice, Mary Robinson came to launch our Climate Justice Fund with the First Minister. I had the great privilege of chairing that session. Food and nutrition, areas where we have considerable expertise. Now, I've previously spoken in this place about the gender impact of climate change. 70% of small farmers in Africa are women, and it is these small farmers who are being most differentially affected by climate change. They're having to go further to forage for fuel, for cooking. They're having to carry water further to water their crops. They are the people who are paying the price for the international injustice that the Western world, the developed world, imposes upon people. And we are privileged in Scotland to be part of the campaign and practical effort that we can make to help such people. Now, Tavish Scott has just spent a great deal of his time talking on 2 international bodies, NATO, the next Secretary-General of which, of course, is the former Prime Minister of Norway, a country comparable, a little smaller, than Scotland, a man who will be taking the hardest decisions that can be taken. Small countries can do that. Now, who is the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations at the moment? Mr. Ashe of Antigua and Barbuda, a country that probably most people here have not heard of. Population in 2011, 81,799. So small countries can punch well above their weight. Mr. Ashe has chaired sessions at the United Nations on international trade and development, information and communications technologies. In the 71st plenary session where he's been on in the chair, they've had discussions on the international financial system. They received keynote reports from a New Zealand-led politician. So small countries are there to do big things on the international stage. It's worth perhaps commenting on Tavish Scott references to South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. Georgia is certainly a country under threat. The Russians came into Abkhazia in the late 90s, South Ossetia more recently. And when I visited Georgia twice in 2006, as an opposition member, I met the government and actually got them to change the law in relation to language, which I was very pleased about indeed. Now, let's just turn to some of the things from the Tories. The Tory spokesman, Jackson Carlaw, has suggested that others are thinking he's not consensual. Well, when your amendment deletes reference to human rights, I think that's stepping away from consensuality. When your amendment deletes reference to humanitarian operations, I think that is to step away from consensuality. When the amendment deletes reference to democracy itself, we see a step away from consensuality. And finally, it deletes reference to global poverty. But most astonishing of all, we heard Jackson Carlaw today commending the work of Labour members at Westminster who saved that institution. By the way, not a democratic institution with 820 unelected and undismissible members in the House of Lords and 650 electable ones in the House of Commons, commended them from saving that institution from making the wrong decision on Syria. I won't, I've no time, I'm sorry.
Mr Stevenson, Stevenson, it's a point of order. Could you resume your seat, please?
I do beg your pardon, Presiding Officer.
Apologies, Mr Stevenson. It was cited as a point of order. Please continue.
That's fine. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland, he is, however, in favour of Scotland having international influence, but he would seek to have institutional arrangements that prevent us being able to do so. As a minister, I attended as a member of the UK ministerial delegation 25 separate occasions in Europe and around the world. Only once did I get to speak on behalf of the UK, and that was in Poland at their economic conference for the very simple reason that the UK sent only one minister, and that minister was me. Otherwise, even when the UK minister is absent, as Paul Heelhouse has found, we don't get to speak. We have to move to a world where Scotland can go to the important occasions, give what we have to give, which is very substantial, and get the decisions that matter to us. Go, give, get. And until that happens, Presiding Officer, we are not truly making the contribution we should and must make.
Thank you very much. Apologies for the interruption. Margaret McCulloch, to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The world we live in is constantly changing and evolving. Economic change, technological change and political change has shaped a world today that is very different from the one that I grew up in. The end of the Iron Curtain, the European single currency, the internet and mobile devices, terrorism and war, but also peace and reconciliation. None of us know what the future really holds, and many of us would have struggled to predict the defining historic moments of our past. The world is in flux, it always has been. But that doesn't mean that people are just bystanders in a world of permanent change. Societies, governments and movements can make a difference. Remember, it was just last year the UN General Assembly agreed the Arms Trade Treaty to regulate the international trade in conventional arms. There would be no treaty without the campaigning efforts of NGOs and people like David Grimison, or governments across the globe showing the political will to make the world safer. And after the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh, campaigners secured a major victory when 150 companies signed up to accords which are protecting trade unions and making Bangladeshi factories safer. But I don't have to look very far away from my home to see people influencing, changing and shaping the world. I'm proud of my hometown, East Kilbride, Scotland's most successful new town, a fair trade town and home to DFID, where 600 civil servants help deliver the world's second largest aid budget. As we debate our constitutional future and as we consider Scotland's global role, I want to make sure that we all recognise the amazing contribution that DFID staff make every day to people in the developing world. I also want to be clear about why I believe a yes vote would disrupt the work of DFID and the civil servants who are based at Abercrombie House in East Kilbride. Presiding Officer, since its establishment in 1997, the Department for International Development has become internationally recognised as a world-leading development agency. There can be no surer sign of the success of DFID than the consensus which exists around so much of what it has achieved. 0.7% of national income at last being spent on aid. Skilled, experienced DFID staff working in Whitehall, in East Kilbride and in 28 countries across Africa, Asia and the Middle East. Cross-party agreement on aid so that this government and future governments go on supporting schools, medicines and disaster relief around the world. And as a government department, DFID has its own Secretary of State with a seat at the Cabinet table. I believe that thanks to hard work of civil servants at home and abroad, DFID has been an international success story, even if I don't always share the politics of the ministers who happen to be in charge at any particular point in time. However, I understand the importance of challenging and scrutinising DFID's record on aid, just as we have to challenge and scrutinise the claims made in the White Paper and about what independence means for development. Now that the UK finally spends 0.7% of its GNI on overseas development assistance, I wouldn't want to see our contribution to the developing world diminish. Yet, if Scotland were to become independent and the UK's GNI were to become smaller, then we could expect to see continuing UK aid spending fall by around £1 billion. Meanwhile, the more an independent Scotland spends in establishing a new overseas development agency and its administration costs, the less it has to spend on aid. And what about East Kilbride? The International Development Committee believe that DFID will pull out within 5 years, with one of the most successful government relocations of the past 30 years undone and development jobs brought back to London. A new Scottish agency might save some staff from redundancy, but given that many of the jobs at DFID are highly specialised, I'm afraid that this key operational centre would be broken up. Jobs would be repatriated by the rest of the UK and East Kilbride would lose out. Don't take my word for it, listen to David Fish, who headed up DFID's African programme. He described the Scottish Government's claims as simply not credible. Presiding Officer, we all agree that Scotland should aspire to be a good global citizen, not just our governments, but the NGOs and movements alluded to in the Labour amendment. But in debating our role in the world, let's not lose sight of the fantastic work being done right now in East Kilbride, where as part of the UK, we are the proud home of DFID, which is dispensing the world's second biggest aid budget to make the world a better, fairer place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jimmy Day to be followed by Maureen Ward.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Given its size and population, Scotland is never going to be or aspire to be a global superpower. But we can, as the Minister set out in his speech and as the Government has laid out in the White Paper, be an active and good global citizen. The scale of the global challenges, of course, are immense. Tackling climate change, responding to global pandemics such as HIV and AIDS, and taking the measures to deal with cybersecurity remind us that all countries, whatever their size, are interdependent, a point also made by Christina McKelvey in her contribution. And these challenges do cut across national boundaries and legal jurisdictions, and finding the solutions to them requires intergovernmental institutions and international cooperation on a scale which global institutions such as the United Nations and the World Bank, established after the Second World War, have so far failed to provide. Professor Ian Golden, director of the Oxford Martin School, encapsulates this succinctly. He states, "The stakes could not be higher. Unless we are able to more effectively manage the risks associated with globalisation, they will overwhelm us. This is the core challenge of our times. And while we will debate with passion and conviction whether Scotland's aspirations to be a good global citizen can best be met as a small independent country working with others, setting our own aims, partnerships and priorities, or as a medium-sized state still coming to terms with the loss of empire, as Jackson Carlaw would prefer, we can at least agree that Scotland has the opportunity to play a key leadership role in a number of important areas. In promoting climate justice, the Climate Change Scotland Act of 2009, an achievement of this Parliament, has set in law some of the firmest and most ambitious climate change targets. Scotland is a world leader in advancing climate justice and is actively addressing the needs of vulnerable people around the world by providing £3 million for the second round of the Climate Justice Fund.
Scotland can also play a vital leadership role in removing nuclear weapons from these islands and making its own contribution to nuclear non-proliferation. Scotland continues to develop innovative responses to the challenges that face the international community and the developing world. New ways are constantly being sought to reach the potential of what Scotland has to offer and channel the energies and efforts of the many non-governmental organisations, agencies and volunteers who are active in improving the lives and opportunities of thousands across the world, often in the most difficult and demanding circumstances imaginable, as Siobhan McMahon outlined in her speech. I welcome the public campaign by the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund and Christian Aid to put the issues of fair trade and ethical practice at the heart of the Scottish Government's own procurement process. I tabled an amendment at stage 2 of the Procurement Reform Bill with the support of the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, and I was pleased that the strength of the arguments deployed by me and by the Fair Trade Forum persuaded the Government to bring forward its own amendment by ensuring that an authority's procurement strategy should set out a clear statement of its general policy on fairly and ethically traded goods and services. Presiding Officer, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Mercy Corps, one such organisation that has its European headquarters based in my constituency and continues to succeed in advancing humanitarian causes on a truly global scale. Mercy Corps has benefited from over £1 million of Scottish Government funding to implement 8 projects in 6 countries. This ranges from projects assisting the most basic needs, such as access to water, sanitation and hygiene, to a youth entrepreneurship project in Kashmir in India. In addition, the Scottish Government is providing almost £400,000.
Sarah Boyack. Just a brief intervention. I completely agree with the comments that the member is making about Mercy Corps, but we do not also acknowledge the huge amount of money that Mercy Corps have been allocated by the UK Government, for example, for good governance work in Pakistan.
Sarah Boyack will know from my contributions in previous debates that I have put on record my appreciation of the contribution, particularly in relation to Syria, that is made by the UK Government and the Department for International Development. So I don't think we're in disagreement on that. The Scottish Government is providing almost £400,000 of funding for a Mercy Corps programme which seeks to support community midwives in Pakistan. Pakistan has the 3rd highest number of maternal death in the world. And working with the Scottish Government and partners across the world, Mercy Corps is helping to train and support 90 midwives to set up as self-employed practitioners, offering life-saving services in a sustainable way. Though these projects are diverse in their scale and objectives, what unites them is the fact that they succeed in capturing the added value that Scottish expertise can bring to international aid efforts and taps into the almost limitless resource of innovation and inventiveness that Scotland is famous for.
Final minute.
One example of such innovation can be found in the representations made to me by my constituent, Mr Alan McKinney. Mr McKinney has for over 20 years harboured an ambition to see Scotland play a leading role in advancing humanitarian relief efforts across the world. He has put forward a bold proposal which would see Prestwick Airport become a centre for international relief efforts and form a permanent base to allow for coordinated European responses to disasters and emergencies. No such permanent centre exists in Europe at present. This begs the question, why? Why not, and why not in Scotland? Now, I accept that this would not be possible within the constraints of budget that the Scottish Government has available to it, but it is an idea that could be developed and explored with independence. And turning to Stuart Stevenson's point in my final seconds, smaller countries are more agile in developing clear strategies and exploiting their comparative advantage in international development. We have much to learn from the Scandinavian countries, and in conclusion, another world is possible, and we in Scotland can help to shape that world.
Thank you. Maureen Watts, to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Officer, I am pleased to be taking part in this debate, not only because of my role as convener of the cross-party group on Malawi, but also to highlight the sterling work being done in this field in my constituency and other projects that I have learned about recently. As a nation, Scotland has never been good at blowing its own trumpet, and that's true in the area of climate justice as it is in other fields. As others have said, Scotland became the first country anywhere where its government established a climate justice fund based on the concept that nations which have benefited from industrialisation have the obligation to help less developed countries adapt to the consequences of climate change. It is an accolade which has been recognised by Mary Robinson, the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Al Gore and many others. And indeed, this has become a very timely debate in light of the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as Rob Gibson highlighted in topical questions earlier. I mentioned projects based in my constituency, and researchers from the James Hutton Institute, together with international organisations and institutions on the ground, are working on two initiatives. The first is the Waters Project, which is focused on supporting local government and communities plan for future natural resource management in the face of climate change. It works in 4 districts of Malawi that are particularly vulnerable to droughts and floods. It helps communities to take ownership of environmental planning and coordinate work across administrative levels with a view to increasing resilience and adaptation to climate change. The project is led by VSO with the support of the Centre of Environmental Policy and Advocacy, LEAD Southern and Eastern Africa, the Malawi Ministry for Local Government and the James Hutton Institute. And this is funded by a £490,000 grant from the Scottish Government's Climate Justice Fund over 3 years. Another project that the James Hutton Institute is involved in is the Climate Smart Agriculture Programme. This project is funded with a grant of £397,341 from the Scottish Government's International Development Programme. This programme looks at the underlying issue of soil health in Malawi so that farmers can get the maximum yield possible with as little reliance as possible on fertilisers and pesticides, which are probably economically and environmentally unsustainable in the long term. And I was delighted to learn last week that through the Scottish Government's International Development Small Grants Programme, Minister, that the Orscoff Foundation was awarded £50,874 for its food forest project, which works in providing training in permaculture and income generation activities for households and small farmers in the Mangochi district. And it will help, again, farmers to become more resilient to climate change and diversify their food production through the project. This is obviously a charitable project through the Orscoff Foundation, which was set up by Bob Orscoff, who worked for many years at the Macaulay Institute, as it was known then, and whom I met several times as his wife was a regional councillor on Grampian Region, so that it's very fitting that this charitable foundation project dovetails in with the Climate Smart project, which the James Hutton Institute is very involved in. I'd also like to mention the work of CFAL in Scotland and the work of May East. In her work in conferences throughout the world, she highlights the work of the Scottish Government through the Climate Justice Fund, the Climate Challenge Fund and Scotland, a Hydronation Act, where our expertise in this area is used abroad. And because Scotland is only a sub-state, we're often not invited onto the international stages where this is discussed. But because of the work is so important and is beginning to be recognised worldwide, Scotland, even although it is a sub-state, is invited to show what can be done. So Scotland is in an excellent position to assist citizens worldwide and become much better as a global citizen. For example, in the 1990s, Norway almost managed to get agreement among countries in the Middle East, scuppered only when the big boys came in. Scotland also hosted the first dialogue outside the former Soviet Union among parliamentarians from the South Caucasus. In 2003, the delegations from Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan discussed the frozen conflicts in their regions.
Can you bring your remarks to a close?
I will just do that. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, and to paraphrase, Scotland cannot use the example of her power, but we can use the power of our example. And we could do this so much better with a seat by right, not the occasional invitation to the international stage.
I now call on Alex Johnson to be followed by Graham Day. Can I remind you 6 minutes and no more?
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I begin by asking if you will forgive me if I do not choose to use my insecurities as a cloak during the course of this debate. I want to talk about Scotland, a good global citizen. And Scotland has been a good global citizen. Through the last 300 years, we have demonstrated our ability to punch well above our weight and significantly within the United Kingdom demonstrate that Scotland had a great deal to offer. We've heard quite a bit about David Livingstone and his contribution, and the 200th anniversary of his birth is something that we should be celebrating quite actively, because he it was who led this Parliament through history to form its alignment with Malawi, something which I and every other member of this chamber remain proud of. The work that this Parliament has done with Malawi is a true living memorial of the missionary work that David Livingstone did during his lifetime, and something which we should all be proud of. But if we look a little further back in Scotland's history, during the Scottish Enlightenment, Scotland did so much to indicate its success on a global stage. The work of David Hume commands a great deal of respect internationally, but I have to say, am more of an Adam Smith man, and therefore the Wealth of Nations is what I take as Scotland's great contribution during that period, because it was Adam Smith who told us that it is possible for nations to generate wealth as with individuals, and that we can work on ensuring that that wealth is spread. It happened within countries, and it can happen internationally. And that's why whatever we say today, whatever we say about our contributions in terms of international aid, and we should be proud of them, whatever we say about the charitable work that goes on, we must never forget, and a number of speakers have said this today, that trade plays a vital role in ensuring that we work together with other countries. It has to be said that trade can deliver a great deal. It worries me slightly that a couple of speakers on the Labour benches have taken the opportunity today to raise the issue of the procurement bill, because the Labour Party have tried very hard to amend that and use the opportunity to guarantee that trade will be conducted in a particular way. But I worry that some of these amendments, if they were approved, may actually give future governments the opportunity, or the excuse perhaps, to exclude foreign companies and foreign farmers from trading into our economy here. I don't want excuses in that bill for protectionism in the future, and we must be very careful not to do that. We have, of course, spoken today about how an independent Scotland, I believe, would legislate for 0.7% of its gross national income to be dedicated to international aid. A strange claim to be made at this point, when we are already within a United Kingdom which is the first developed nation to have achieved that target. A little more thanks for those of us who have spoken on that subject for that achievement would be worthwhile. However, I need to move on to talk about a couple of key issues that have been raised in this debate. The first is Scotland's potential to contribute towards sustainable agriculture on a world basis. It is sad for me to reflect that Scotland was a nation that led the development of genetic technology in food crop production. It saddens me even more so to see that the great work that was done by the then Scottish Crop Research Institute at Invergowrie was ultimately wasted, because that technology was allowed to fall almost exclusively into the hands of a few companies that use it perhaps for the wrong reasons. Had Scotland maintained its interest and investment in GM technology, then we would have had today the opportunity to provide the crops to farmers in developing worlds that were resistant to disease, that were resistant to parasites, that were resistant to drought and to the presence of salt in their environment. And the fact that we have turned our back on that technology here in Scotland is a disadvantage to the world, and one that's doubly so given that the technology is now controlled by others and not by us. There is another issue I have to go back to, and it's one that initially was raised by Jackson Carlaw during the course of his remarks. He it was who pointed out that Scotland, as part of the United Kingdom, was absolutely influential through the intervention of its members of Parliament in determining international policy in Syria, by first influencing the direction of the UK government, which then went on to influence the direction of the United States government. There is an example of what Scotland can achieve within the Union. But there's one other point relating to our military involvement that I cannot allow to pass without making a remark on it. The Minister, in his opening statement, said, and I quote, that never again would our sons and daughters be sent abroad to participate in illegal wars. I hope we've got that right. Sadly, this is a narrow and misguided interpretation, because if we achieve the independence that he aspires to, what would happen is that Scotland's sons and daughters would choose to go on serving within the military organisations they are currently members of, but they would have no representation within the Parliament that makes decisions on their behalf.
You need to end now.
That, in my view, is a sin that we should not commit.
I now call Graham Day, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the MSP for Angus South, I don't have to look far to see a tangible illustration of Scotland's historical standing as a good global citizen. My constituency office is located just yards from Arbroath Abbey, home of the Declaration of Arbroath, a document the Senate of the United States of America acknowledged in 1998. Their own Declaration of Independence had been styled upon. And I think in this week, which marks the 694th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath, it would be remiss of us not to highlight this particular example of Scotland reaching out positively to the wider world. For it is accepted that the US version was, through influence on its principal author, Thomas Jefferson, by one William Small, heavily based on the document which set Scotland on the road to freedom in 1320. Small, originally from Carmiley, just outside Arbroath, was appointed Professor of Mathematics and Natural Philosophy at William and Mary College in Williamsburg in 1758. Amongst his pupils was Jefferson, who went on to chair the committee commissioned to draft a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, who became the third President of the USA and who is claimed was actually a descendant of Thomas Randolph, one of the signatories of the Declaration of Arbroath, never hid his admiration for Small, admitting that meeting the Angus-born academic had, and I quote, probably fixed the destinies of my life. Little wonder then perhaps that as the 20th century drew to a close, the US Senate moved to mark the links between the Declaration of Arbroath and their own declaration by unanimously backing a resolution from Senator Trent Lott to fix April 6 as a day upon which America would acknowledge the contribution of Scots to the development of their nation. In the preamble to the resolution, Lott stated, April 6 is of special significance for all Americans, and especially Americans of Scottish descent, because the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scottish Declaration of Independence, was signed on April 6, 1320, and the American Declaration of Independence was modelled on that inspirational document. What more striking historical example of this nation's positive impact in the world could we have than our most famous document accepted as the first expression of the idea of a contractual monarchy and an eloquent plea for the liberty of man, being recognised by one of the major democracies in the world in this way. And, Presiding Officer, I would point to a gathering of Consul-Generals taking place in Arbroath on Friday, involving, amongst others, Japan, Norway, Ukraine and Ireland, to celebrate the Declaration and start the countdown to the 700th anniversary as further evidence of the standing of the document in global terms. Ahead of this weekend's Tartan Day celebrations, I popped into the Abbey yesterday to see a newly deployed display which explains the links between the two declarations. I'm sure those visiting the Abbey for a weekend of events celebrating the signing of the Declaration will find it interesting and informative, and will reflect upon the connection as a fine example of this great nation's credentials as a good global citizen. Good global citizenship, of course, can be found in a variety of guises, but whatever form it takes, it invariably is informed by qualities of fairness and justice, and in a modern-day context, sustainability and environmental responsibility. Just as it reached out to the world seeking to do good over many centuries, the Scotland of today seeks to do the right thing, not just talking about fairness, equality and environmental responsibility, but delivering upon that. We are a fair trade nation with fair trade communities the length and breadth of the country, not because it ticks a box, but because we believe that is how a good global citizen behaves. And this Parliament introduced world-leading climate change legislation, not because it would bring us kudos, but because it was the right thing to do for our benefit and that of the planet, its inhabitants and its future. And the creation of the Climate Justice Fund and the impact it's having is further proof where it needed of our commitment to setting an example for the rest of the world. And as the Minister said earlier, trying to rebalance injustice. Of course, in climate change terms, driving down emissions, we have to deliver on this. And it was therefore encouraging to attend last week's briefing here in Parliament, hosted by my colleague Rob Gibson, from the UK Climate Change Committee's Professor Jim Skee. Yes, owing to the revision of the greenhouse gas inventory, we did narrowly miss the 2011 targets. But the 2014 progress report was clear on the direction of travel, stating that Scotland has made good progress. And the report came amidst further positive announcement that Scotland last year generated 46% of its energy needs from renewable sources, and greenhouse gas emissions from our power stations fell by 6.5 million tonnes carbon equivalent between 2008 and 2012. But as the IPCC report on climate change has laid bare, stating global warming is likely to have a severe, pervasive and irreversible impact on humans, health, homes, food and safety, we must build on those efforts. As a good global citizen, I believe Scotland will do that.
Thank you, Mr Day. I now call on Sarah Boyack to be followed by Richard Light.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We do meet the day after the publication of the IPCC's work on climate change. And what it says to us is that we all need to act. I think the statement that the latest report should jolt people into action is something we have to think about very seriously. Widespread food shortages, water scarcity and climate refugees. These are the realities that will need to be discussed and will need to be acted on in the next few years. And for all of us, if Scotland is to be a good global citizen, that shouldn't just be a soundbite. That should inform everything this government does, and it should involve everything we all do together. And it should be a call to action for all of us and for the communities we represent. Because our actions should be driven by values. The values that we should aspire to in Scotland, such as fairness, equality, promoting social justice and solidarity. In the work that we do here, those principles should be applicable in the work we do abroad. So when we commit to abolishing child poverty in Scotland, that commitment should not be limited to Scotland. It must inform our contribution to international development too. And the fact that 22% of the world live in extreme poverty, the vast majority of them women, that should concern us. And that means that we should be using our debate here to think about what the next framework for the Millennium Development Goals should actually look like. I think Patricia Ferguson was right to raise that in her opening remarks. I don't agree with the Minister when he says that if Scotland were to leave the UK, we could do so much more. Actually, there is so much more that we could do now together. And what we need to be thinking about is not just focusing on in or out. We should be thinking about what powers we have here. And the powers we have here are not just financial. They are the powers of leadership. They're the power to inspire people, they're the power to coordinate people, and they're the power to make the real difference. And I think there's more that we could be doing. While there's much to be proud of, NIDOS suggests that we should be explicit. We should make our values explicit so that we can be held accountable. I think that's a good principle. And I think that should be a principle that applies to every level of government, because there's much that we could be proud of, but there's more we could do. So when we look at the good things on health and education and climate change, on transferring engineering and renewable skills, we've got to think about this as being a two-way street. It's not just us imparting knowledge, it's also us learning from experience. It's us reflecting on the experience of people we work with in different communities. And I think while there's much to be proud of, there is an awful lot more to be done. So let's not make the independence debate a diversionary discussion. Let's keep a focus on what more we can do, regardless of where the border lies between Scotland and England. And regardless of whether we're in the UK or out of the UK, there is a huge amount more that this government can do. As the Scotland-Malawi Partnership note, people have been mobilised. People are committed to use their skills, whether it's the skills of ordinary communities or whether it's specialised skills. The fact that every single university is part of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership is something we should all be proud of. So I think there's a challenge for us in this discussion today to think about how we all exert leadership, how the Scottish Government in particular exerts leadership and could build capacity to help our civic organisations, our charities, our NGOs, who are making an invaluable contribution. I think the point that Jim Eadie made, the point that was made earlier by Maureen Watt when she was here, they are appropriate comments to make. And the comments that were made about the work being done in East Kilbride and the comments being made by Siobhan McMahon, I'd also want to agree with. There's a discussion we're having, and Alex Johnson said we shouldn't be going there, about the procurement bill, but to me it's fundamental. Our relationships should be about commerce as much as good principles and about doing the nice things we'd all agree with. We have to ask some tougher questions. We decided we wanted to be a fair trade nation because people as consumers wanted to act. They wanted to act immediately, and they wanted to make sure that the money they spent was used properly, so that the money they spent would drive fairer incomes for farmers across the globe, to let them invest in their families, in their local health and education facilities. Then there's the incredible impact of our diaspora communities. Nobody's really mentioned them today, but they are making a fantastic contribution, not just in Scotland, the community they've chosen to come to, but the communities they've left, where they send, in Bangladesh, more money goes back in remittances than actually goes in international aid. So we should also be thinking about the power of government, but also about the power of communities and about the power of communities to work together. The procurement bill is weaker than it should be, and it's absolutely not about excluding farmers in other countries. It's about giving them a chance to trade with us, about making sure they are not excluded. And when we think about those issues, we need to think about the power that our citizens can have. I was reflecting on the Make Poverty History demo 9 years ago. That is what led to the 0.7% of our money being spent on international development. It was the work of citizens that made all the parties sign up to that ensured the cancellation of debt for the poorest countries, and that let us, as the UK, lead the way and work with other countries. But there is much more that we could do. We can create a better world through working in partnership, through networks, and I believe as part of the UK, I didn't think this should be the focus of our debate, but it's been made the focus of our debate.
Can you start bringing your remarks to a close?
Scotland gets the best of both worlds. We need to make the most of those worlds. Last month, Africa at 50 in the Scottish Parliament.
Sorry, Ms Boyack, you're cutting into the last speaker's time.
In trade. I hope we...
I now call Richard Lyle. Mr Lyle, you've got 4 minutes.
As already has been said today, I believe that Scotland has a distinctive contribution to make in its work with developing countries, recognising our global responsibility. This is demonstrated by Scotland establishing a Climate Justice Fund. The concept of climate justice is that nations which have benefited from industrialisation have the obligation to help less developed countries to adapt to the consequences of climate change. Projects in the fund are helping communities, as already has been stated, affected by the climate change in Malawi and Zambia. The fund will make a real difference to people's lives in these countries. Scotland has a commitment to play its role in recognising the challenges faced by the developing world, recognising our identity as a responsible nation. Presiding Officer, with September the 18th and the independence vote coming ever closer, I believe that we have shown that Scotland has shown the world that it is ready to be an independent nation. We will do this by joining well-known and well-respected organisations such as the European Union, the United Nations and NATO. With independence, Scotland's voice in the world will be stronger than ever, and we will use this voice to promote democracy, international law, climate justice and human rights. With independence, we will also be able to support and promote nuclear disarmament and look forward to the opportunity to add to our name to those states that have ratified the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. With independence, Scotland will have many new powers that we have long sought and that I have long fought for in the years that I have been in the SNP. However, we will not try to be, as was said earlier by my good friend Jim Eadie, we will not try to be a global superpower, but we can be a good global citizen. Through partnership with other nations, as all countries are interdependent. And in Scotland's future, 3 overlapping ideas were set out for our international relations. Those being, firstly, our partnership with other nations of these islands. Secondly, a regional role as an active member of the EU with strong links to Nordic countries and the Arctic. Thirdly, our independent role in international organisations. Scotland will continue to be a good global citizen through our commitment to international law, our respect for human rights and good governance. And today, I support this motion and the situation that has been set out by the Minister, and I also compliment the Minister on the good work that he is doing in promoting Scotland in its way of going forward in the nation and the way that we're going forward in the world. Scotland, after the 18th September, I hope that Scotland will join the international community as an independent country. Thank you.
We now move to wind-up speeches. Can I call Jim McGregor? Mr McGregor, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close today's debate for the Scottish Conservatives, and I thank those organisations which have provided briefings for today, including NIDOS and SkyAF. There have been some good and constructive speeches, including from my colleagues Alex Johnson and Jackson Carlaw, who set out some of the key benefits Scots enjoy internationally from the UK's presence and connections globally, not least through our first-class international diplomatic network, which provides assistance to our citizens in so many countries. Scotland has very significant international clout each and every day by being part of the UK with its permanent membership of key global organisations like NATO, the UN Security Council and the G8. These are important, tangible things and mean that Scots consistently have representation at the top table internationally and can help shape international decisions, and we shouldn't take these for granted. And I should also mention the British Council offices. There are over 200 of these worldwide, which are used by Scots, and they supply. In 2012, the British Council facilitated 1,000 international school partnership projects in Scotland, and the UK's international scholarship programmes, such as Chevening, bring many scholars to Scottish universities, generating significant income for those universities. Other countries who don't have our international influence often look on in envy. And I want to pick out some of the themes that have emerged strongly in the debate before looking at parts of the government's motion and our amendment. A number of members have rightly highlighted what Scotland has given to the world and the impact our nation has had globally, both in the last 300 years and in our contribution today. Like other members, I'm very proud of what Scotland has achieved and what we do internationally today as part of our United Kingdom. The Minister describes it as positive outward-looking engagement with the world. I agree with him. One of our greatest periods in terms of global impact and influence was the Scottish Enlightenment, which occurred only a few years after the Act of Union. Indeed, at that time, Scotland, at last secure domestically, transformed and confident, led the developed world through its intellectual enlightenment, and Scottish thinkers like Adam Smith and David Hume, mentioned by Alex Johnston, established systems of ideas that still underpin the economics and philosophy of modern liberal democracies. Later, Scottish inventors like Alexander Graham Bell, John Logie Baird, developed technology that led to the interconnected, modern, dynamic, fast-moving world of the communications most of us enjoy today. Today, individual Scots also play leading roles in the international human efforts across the globe. Dalmally, my local village in Argyll, is the headquarters of Mary's Meals, founded and run by my inspirational constituent and neighbour, Magnus MacFarlane Barrow. It provides a nutritious daily meal to more than 800,000 of the world's poorest children, notably in Malawi, which was mentioned by Patricia Ferguson, Siobhan McMahon, Christine McKelvey, Alex Johnson and others. And we should be very proud that a charity based in the Highlands and Islands is making such a big difference to the lives of so many children throughout the developing world. Other charities from Scotland are also always at the forefront of tackling the consequences of international humanitarian crises. The government's motion refers to the Scottish Government's international development policy. We acknowledge the work that this is being done here, but we shouldn't consider this in isolation, but should look too at the UK picture. Scots, as UK taxpayers, are also supporting the UK's very significant international aid contribution. The Scottish Government's international aid budget is welcome, but is around £9 million per year, while the UK will spend over £12 billion annually on overseas aid by 2015, meaning we are the first of the G8 countries to meet the 0.7% of GNI target. This aid is helping to both save and transform the lives of millions, some of the most poor people in the less developed world. The government's motion also refers to climate justice, and we agree this is an important policy area. However, again, Scots are also contributing a great deal to this through the UK. We must assess things in context. Scotland's £6 million Climate Justice Fund, while very welcome, compares with almost £4 billion in the UK is providing through the International Climate Fund. These contributions are as much Scotland's and Scots as those from the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government should recognise that and work together with the UK Department for International Development. Scotland is doing a huge amount for international development and climate justice, fulfilling its role as a global citizen as part of the UK. And to conclude, Presiding Officer, I want to pay tribute to all those Scots and Scottish organisations that help fulfil Scotland and the UK's roles as good global citizens and are undertaking some of the very best international aid projects that exist. We can be proud of Scotland and the UK's position and confident that Scotland can and will achieve even more for the planet's poorest people as we go forward as one United Kingdom, playing a big part on the world stage. And I support the amendment in the name of Jackson Carlow.
I now call on Patricia Ferguson. Ms Ferguson, you've got 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an interesting debate and has given us the opportunity to explore, perhaps in a wider way than I thought we might, the issues reflected in the motion and in the amendments. I very much welcome the fact that the UK has become the first global player to reach the 0.7% of GNI contribution. I think that's something that we all in this chamber should be proud of and something that we should talk about more often. Having said that, however, I'm afraid that I don't think I can support the Conservative amendment, not because I object to any of the wording of it, but simply because the way in which it's been structured means that some of the other good parts of the original motion, and indeed our own amendment, would be knocked out. So it's for no reason other than that we will abstain on that motion this evening. And I think the debate this afternoon has been largely consensual. Although I have to say that the propensity of the SNP to bring everything back to the issue of independence really depresses me sometimes, because people in Malawi don't care if the help they get comes from an independent Scotland or from a Scotland that's a strong Scotland and a strong UK. And that's what we should be concentrating our efforts on. But there are a number of issues that I would like to return to this afternoon. I think that we would all agree, no matter what our positions on other issues, that the position of women in the developing world merits special mention. In many countries, girls are less likely to receive formal education beyond the primary school level than their male peers. This is particularly the case in countries where education is not free. But there are other challenges for young women, such as the lack of sanitation, which often makes it much more difficult for them to remain in education. Now, that's not only a waste of the talents of individual girls and women, but it can hold back entire families, as it's often the women in the developing world who are responsible for the household and who are instrumental in taking forward the next generation to achieve their potential. I would sincerely hope that the increasing numbers of women in the developing world who are now beginning to hold political office, some of them high political office, might help to resolve that particular issue. And I've spoken to a number of female politicians from around the Commonwealth particularly, for whom this is nothing less than a mission. They understand the imperative to get the young women of their country into education, but they need our help and support, and they need it now. I would also want to say a few words about the plight of those caught up in the tragedy that is engulfing Syria. We rarely hear of Syria on our TV news these days. We've moved on to other tragedies in other parts of the world. But people are still losing their lives and being forced to flee their homes on a daily basis. In fact, so severe is the crisis in terms of refugees that the population of Lebanon has increased by a quarter. Imagine if our population increased in the space of a couple of months or a few years by a quarter. We would not be able to cope, and the countries around Syria cannot cope at the moment. So I was delighted when I heard that the UK government had succumbed to pressure and would now accept Syrian refugees into our country. But my delight changed to real disappointment when I realised that they were talking about relatively small numbers. But the move is very welcome nonetheless. And of course, the Scottish Government's pledge to play its part in accepting refugees is very welcome. And I'm very pleased to be able to praise the UK Government for the level of assistance that has been given in other ways to help to mitigate the problems being experienced by Syrians, both in Syria and beyond its boundaries. In a previous members' debate that I led, presiding officer, about the plight of the Syrian refugees, I mentioned a call made by Gordon Brown MP, which I think bears repeating. Gordon Brown, having considered the refugee situation very carefully, pointed out that we were in real danger of having an entire generation of young Syrians who, because of the turmoil in their country, would have no education. He went on to suggest that just as in previous century, the idea of medical treatment continuing in times of war had become the norm, leading to the establishment of the Red Cross and Red Crescent and organisations like Médecins Sans Frontières, that we, in this time, should work to ensure that the young people of Syria and those caught up in other crises should still be able to have an education. I think that is a principle that we could all aspire to. And perhaps with our country's proud record in education, it's something that we could lead on. Now, I know the Minister listened very carefully to that suggestion during the debate and has not by any matter of means discounted the idea. But it is perhaps something that we could work on across parties, as we've done with other issues concerning international development and our role in it. Because Sarah Boyack was absolutely right. We have to do more. We have to continue to do more. And we have to inspire and we have to lead. And perhaps this is one issue where we could step up to the mark and really make a difference. Presiding officer, for me, Siobhan McMahon reminded us what this debate really should be about. And I'm very proud, as colleagues probably know, of the fact that churches and schools in my constituency contributed over £1,400 last year to the SCIAF Wee Box appeal. The work that the kind of organisation that SCIAF does is the kind of work that we need to support and we need to encourage. And I would agree entirely with Jamie McGregor's comments about Mary's Meals and the work done by that charity. Part of it is now in my own constituency. I think it's mainly the storage element of it is in my constituency. And I'm very proud that we have a small part, if only a small part, of Mary's Meals in my constituency too, because that organisation does such great work around Africa particularly. I would just gently say to Stuart Stevenson, I'm very sorry that he was so disappointed not to be able to speak on behalf of the UK and to take the UK's chair in Europe. But maybe it's sometimes the way you approach these things, because I certainly, as a minister, took the UK chair and I certainly spoke on behalf of the UK, and I was very proud to do it. And I was proud to do so not just as a proud Scot, but also as someone who was representing my colleagues in Wales and Ireland and in England too. And I think that that is something that is a possibility for us to take forward. Now, both Christina McKelvey and Alex Johnson mentioned commerce, but perhaps in slightly different ways. And I would just say to Alex Johnson in terms of trade and commerce too, in my view, Commerce has to be shaped to ensure that it is something that supports our values and our aims. And I would concur with comments made by Pope Benedict recently, when he was still in office, that is, when he said that the core purpose of economic life is not for the good of itself, but for the good of human beings. In other words, the economy is there to serve the needs of people and not the other way around.
I'm sorry, the members in our last 10 seconds.
Sorry, Mr Johnson, we can debate that elsewhere. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I would want to pay tribute to all the Scottish aid organisations, whether they are based in Scotland or are Scottish in and of themselves, who work in international development, and all those Scots who are involved in international development, whether it's because they put money in a wee box or whether it's because they're working on the ground in some of the conflict zones and working in situations that test their bravery. They all deserve our respect and they all deserve our praise in a debate like this.
Thank you, Ms Ferguson. I now call on Hamza Yousaf to wind up the debate. Mr Yousaf, you have till 5 o'clock.
Presiding Officer, I would like to welcome all the contributions that were made. We may have disagreed in some parts of it, but by and large, an excellent debate with some fantastic points that I'll try to reflect on and respond to in my closing remarks. Presiding Officer, I want to pay a special tribute to those organisations that do a fantastic job in Scotland in terms of coordination of our international development organisations across Scotland. The Scottish-Malawi Partnership, with over 600 members, from schools to churches to faith groups to the whole gambit, and of course NIDOS as well, over 100 members part of that umbrella body. They do a fantastic job of coordinating efforts the length and breadth of the country. I also want to thank the number of groups that have been involved in making Scotland and helping us to gain the status as a fair trade nation, only the second in the world, of course, just after Wales, the world's other fair trade nation. I'm very, very proud that I got to announce that as one of my first jobs as a minister. But the importance of that, and why I mention it, is because that is the kind of work that has been taken forward very much by our children. The recognition within schools and primary schools, and in fact even nurseries, nursery school children, of fair trade, I think is a great standard bearer for when we look at the future. And this debate, if anything, is about Scotland being a good global citizen in the future. And on that basis, a number of members across the chamber mentioned and quite rightly described Scotland as having leadership when it came to the issue of climate change and climate justice in particular. And emphasising that point again, Presiding Officer, that this is not an issue of aid and charity, but one of justice. Delighted that the First Minister announced in October the doubling of that fund. That second £3 million round of funding will open this year, deliver particularly on a human rights-based approach, which was mentioned by Siobhan McMahon, and what I thought was an excellently powerful contribution. It will again be focused this second round on the Scottish Government's 4 priority African countries. The first priority for the fund will be to deliver that human rights-based approach that I talked about, but empowering those that are the most vulnerable to climate change to realise their rights to natural resources, because it is, as I say, a human rights-based approach. Also, the emphasis will be on climate adaptation, supported by our Hydro Nation Fund. So that will, of course, encapsulate our water-related projects, but we will also consider projects on energy and food security, and particularly keen, I hope, to see applications that come in conjunction with the private sector, because the private sector, although in the past have been much maligned in international development, have a role to play in helping to create the conditions to take people out of poverty. I'm going to try to address some of the points, as I may, that were made in the debate. Jackson Carlo made an excellent speech, I thought, but the one part perhaps he's unsurprised that I disagree with was his the point that he made in relation to the vote on Syria. I thought it was basically a suggestion was that we're better that London makes decisions for us because of that vote. First of all, I'm pleased that he recognised that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary were probably wrong to push for that decision. But secondly, his whole case for Scots remaining in the UK is that Scottish MPs stop the UK government from making silly decisions. I'm not sure that's a good enough reason for example, the 85,000 people that have been hit by the bedroom tax. And by the way, 90% of Scottish MPs voted against the bedroom tax, yet it's been landed on our doorstep. I'm not sure it's good enough for the thousands that are having to go to food banks up and down the country. I'm not sure it's a good enough reason for the 100,000 additional children that are now being suffered into poverty because of austerity measures, as was described by the Child Poverty Action Group. So, if your argument is that Scottish MPs stop the UK Government from making silly decisions, I think it's not a good enough reason at all. In terms of DFID jobs, which were mentioned by a number of members across the chamber, it was actually Michael McCann, MP for East Kilbride, who said the UK Government, and I quote exactly, the UK Government is not doing all it can to protect jobs in DFID. In fact, by DFID's own annual accounts, all you have to do is look into those annual accounts, and they will show that for DFID staff that are based both in London and East Kilbride, the numbers of staff in both locations will increase in March 2011 and up to 2013, but thereafter will decline. In fact, the only guarantee for DFID, of course, is if that 0.7% target was legislated for. It is not legislated for, but we, as the Scottish Government, have said with independence we will legislate that commitment. And on that commitment, I find it bizarre. I have been one of the first to congratulate the UK Government on reaching that. Long overdue, but credit where credit due. And indeed, the Prime Minister showed himself a personal endeavour to reach that 0.7% target. However, we shouldn't use it to boast that we are the first G8 country, or the UK is the first G8 country to achieve that target. Just as a reminder, the G8 is a group of 8 countries, collective of countries that are the most industrialised in the world. For one of those countries to have missed that target for 40 years, that's £87.5 billion of missed aid. It's hardly something that we should be cheering from the rafters about, although I am happy about it. I just hope it can be committed into legislation. In terms of other issues that were mentioned, asylum was mentioned by a number of members across the chamber. Asylum is an important issue because being a good global citizen is about how we help those that are fleeing persecution. I am pleased that the Scottish Government has a fantastic record in helping those who are fleeing and seeking asylum in our country. And those that have said, we are the best of both worlds and we're better together, I don't think that if you were to look into the eyes of an asylum seeker that has their door broken down at 4 in the morning by 6 UKBA Home Office officers, that you could tell them that we have the best of both worlds. I don't think we could tell them that we're good global citizens when we detain women and children in the UK. I don't think we're good global citizens when asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution are made destitute because they're cut off from any support while they're still here. Well, of course.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. On that particular point, how to welcome asylum seekers, do you think that a language like proud Scot using too often maybe is not such a language used for an inclusive society?
Minister.
Proud Scot.
Proud Scot. Yes, I agree with the member. Language is, of course, incredibly important. Just as I finish off, Presiding Officer, the other point I wanted I couldn't not comment on was that of Tavish Scott, and he asked a few questions. I honestly don't know where to begin with his contribution. His complaint was that the UK's response wasn't good enough in Crimea, yet his party, of course, is part of that government there. He suggests that small nations, independent nations, couldn't make difficult decisions. Well, as was mentioned by my colleague Stuart Stevenson, the new NATO Secretary-General, of course, Prime Minister of Norway, the UN General Assembly Secretary John Ash from Antigua and Barbuda, Ireland, of course, previous EU presidents who helped to see through the MFF EU budget. And his last point, I thought, was particularly off-tone. His last point that somehow we had some kind of duplicity in the way we do our international affairs. And when it comes to human rights in China, I'll just read him the quote from Richard Hamer, the Scottish Director of Amnesty International, who said the First Minister, in terms of his speech, has made an important first step by discussing human rights in his speech. Scotland has an important role to play in promoting human rights internationally, and it is great to hear the First Minister acknowledge that profit and principle are not mutually exclusive. But the point about duplicity, what a brass neck to talk about duplicity when the UK government that he supports us remaining a part of UK governments that have sold defence equipment to Saddam Hussein and, of course, illegally invaded that country, killing hundreds of thousands. Condemning, of course, on the one hand, Colonel Gaddafi, while then we had Tony Blair kissing him and canoodling him in his Bedouin tent. Of course, on the one hand, we condemn Mugabe, on the other hand, we've sold him defence equipment. Such a brass neck, I'm surprised he can lift his head off the pillow, presiding officer. So, to end on, presiding officer, I absolutely believe...
You have till 5 o'clock.
To finish with, presiding officer, I agree, Scotland can, with the current constitutional setup, of course, play a role. But I think as an independent country, with the full levers, international and foreign policy levers, we can play a great role as a good global citizen. We have a great history behind us, with Dr. David Livingstone, who was described as Africa's first freedom fighter by Kenneth Kaunda, the President of the Zambian Republic. But also, we have a great history in terms of our literature and our culture. That famous sentence that is known by every member here in the Scottish Parliament, that man to man the world over shall brothers be for all that, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of nationality, be it domestically or internationally, we will, in an independent Scotland, will stand with the poorest in the world and will be a good global citizen.
That concludes the debate on Scotland, a good global citizen. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of a parliamentary bureau motion. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9379 on substitution on committees.
Moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 9547.3 in the name of Patricia Ferguson, which seeks to amend motion number 9547 in the name of Hamza Yousaf on Scotland, a good global citizen, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 9547.1 in the name of Jackson Carlaw, which seeks to amend motion number 9547 in the name of Hamza Yousaf on Scotland, a good global citizen, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 9547.1 in the name of Jackson Carlaw is as follows. Yes, 14. No, 62. There were 33 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9547 in the name of Hamza Yousaf as amended on Scotland, a good global citizen, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9379 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on substitution on committees be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.
The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 9430 in the name of Nanette Millen on self-management of anticoagulation therapy. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Nanette Millen to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm sure we all know that to ensure the efficacy and safety of anticoagulant therapy, usually given orally as warfarin, regular monitoring is essential to ensure its effect stays within the therapeutic range, with the dosage adjusted according to the time it takes for a blood sample to clot. Because serious complications can occur if warfarin is poorly controlled, it's vitally important for patient welfare that the clotting time is checked frequently. And of course, traditionally, this has been done via hospital-based anticoagulant clinics. I first brought the issues of self-monitoring and self-management of anticoagulation therapy to the Chamber in 2010, because it appeared to me to be a cost-effective and beneficial way of enabling appropriate patients to be partners in their care, in line with government policy of encouraging self-monitoring and self-managing of long-term conditions, where that can be done appropriately and safely. At that time, Scotland lagged behind England and the rest of Europe, and this remains the situation today, with only 1% of patients on warfarin in Scotland self-managing their treatment, compared with 2% across the UK as a whole. Approximately 740 people in Scotland out of 25,000 in the UK are self-monitoring, with 70,000 people in Germany doing the same. NHS boards in Scotland generally do not provide support for self-monitoring or self-management of anticoagulation therapy. In NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, for example, only 40 adults, or 0.25% of the 16,000 patients on such treatment are doing so, whereas there's very good provision in York Hill for paediatric patients to self-manage. Unfortunately, as children in that area who can self-manage reach the age of transition to adult services, they have to return their monitors and go back to clinic attendance for treatment. In fact, only 3 health boards in Scotland have protocols for self-management of transitional patients. In my own region, NHS Tayside actively discourages patient self-monitoring, or PSM, and I'm told has even refused support when it was recommended to a patient by a consultant cardiologist. And NHS Grampian as yet gives no formal support, with the development of a protocol for self-monitoring being delayed due to a lack of enthusiasm for it from the various parties that need to be involved. There is, however, growing support for a change, and there are pockets of best practice in Scotland. A good example is Larg's Medical Group, which is actively supporting 13 people to self-test through its active self-management service. And increasingly, there are drivers for change. Sign Guideline 129 on antithrombotics states that self-monitoring and self-dosing is safe and effective and can be considered for some patients. The Royal College of Physicians also encourages the use of self-management, stating that anticoagulation control may be improved by near-patient testing and encouraging patients in their own care. Patient education should be supported at every stage. NHS Scotland's 2020 vision for the NHS emphasises a focus on prevention, anticipation and supporting self-management, with the person at the centre of all decision-making. And finally, NICE draft guidance recommends self-monitoring for people on long-term anticoagulation therapy. The final report by NICE on self-testing systems is due to be published in July, with the expectation that self-testing will be increasingly supported in England and Wales, which could let Scotland slip even further behind. Unfortunately, the greatest resistance to self-testing for those who wish it seems to come from GPs and clinicians, according to the Anticoagulation Self-Monitoring Alliance. This was brought out in a roundtable discussion last year on the potential for self-monitoring of anticoagulation, attended by senior clinicians and patient groups, which resulted in 4 recommendations. 1. Sign Guideline 129 should be supported. 2. A review of the uptake of appropriate technology in Scotland compared with England and the rest of Europe should be undertaken. 3. A learning needs assessment for clinicians, GPs and other healthcare professionals should be carried out. And finally, 4. Consideration should be given to setting up a national service delivery model for anticoagulation to encourage health boards to promote self-management to appropriate patients. With regard to cost effectiveness, studies carried out by the NHS in Mid-Yorkshire and health economists in the University of York showed that the NHS in Scotland could be saved around £600,000 in a year from the prevention of strokes, resulting from the improved control of anticoagulation achieved by self-monitoring patients. Furthermore, all the patients who took part in the Mid-Yorkshire study agreed that self-testing had been beneficial and would recommend it to others. In her response to my earlier debate, the then Health Secretary Nicola Sturgeon was somewhat lukewarm about self-management of anticoagulation, based on earlier clinical advice and on the fact that newer anticoagulant agents might replace warfarin. However, warfarin is still the treatment of choice for many patients, and expert advice is changing. Indeed, looking at replies from the current Health Secretary to some recent parliamentary questions from my colleague Richard Lyle, the Scottish Government is now taking account of Sign Guideline 129. However, with still less than a 1% rate of self-monitoring in Scotland, something doesn't add up. The response from the Government to another question from Richard Lyle about what support is available to patients in transition from paediatric to adult services was that local protocols for the delivery of anticoagulation management vary across Scotland, but are in line with Sign Guideline 129. At the time of transition, ongoing warfarin management, including self-testing, would be agreed as part of the overall plan of health care, clearly not generally the case. So understandably, it's been put to me that there's a significant difference between the answers given to Richard Lyle and the reality on the ground, where little or nothing appears to be happening by way of implementation. I'd welcome the Minister's comments on this in his summing up, because the Government needs to do more to ensure that patients are given the option to self-manage, rather than just to say that this is the case. So I'll conclude, Presiding Officer, as I did in my 2010 speech, because it's still relevant today, by urging the Government to look closely at how anticoagulant therapy is managed and to consider investigating the potential for increasing self-testing and self-management with a view to rolling it out across health boards to suitable patients, thus saving the NHS money and improving the quality of care for the large and increasing number of people in Scotland who need long-term anticoagulation therapy. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I turn to the open debate. I call Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate. I want to begin by thanking Annette Milne for securing debating time this evening. Now, warfarin therapy is, of course, vital to lowering the risk of strokes, heart attacks and other serious problems associated with clots forming in the bloodstream and possibly thereafter travelling through it to cause serious damage to major organs. However, we need to also be aware that while warfarin is a vital drug in the right amounts, it is vitally important to get the right balance right. And as my colleague Annette Milne has observed, creating the circumstances where more people are able to manage their condition is very much in line with the Scottish Government's 2020 vision for NHS services.
Ms MacLeod, could you turn your microphone round slightly? Thank you.
In reading the background material for tonight's debate, I asked myself why what is being advocated is not in fact being more widely done now. And clearly, however, the key test that must be applied to every possible new development is the extent to which it is safe and effective. Certainly self-testing and self-management are standard practice for other long-term conditions. And I've often used the example in this chamber of the telemedicine diabetes clinic at the Galloway Community Hospital in Stranraer, which uses DiSend technology, specialist nurses and secure video conferencing to relieve patients of a very long round trip to see their consultant, and which gives them back flexibility into their day-to-day lives. And I can certainly see at face value the benefits of similar approaches to blood testing for warfarin prescribing. And in addition, there is evidence which supports the clinical effectiveness of both near-patient testing and self-testing. And as is so often the case, it may well be that a mixture of approaches is the most effective. Now, I note from the information that has been circulated to members that NHS Defence in Galloway, although it doesn't have a patient self-monitoring protocol, now advises that it will look to support patient self-monitoring going forward, which I certainly welcome, given the distances that some patients in the region have to travel to access healthcare. And in that regard, I also want to mention, Presiding Officer, the work which the Digital Health Institute is doing on the detection of atrial fibrillation using a device which can be used by a patient in their own home and which can in fact be purchased right now on Amazon. Atrial fibrillation is an important factor in identifying patients who are likely to benefit from the use of anticoagulant drugs. So detection of atrial fibrillation in the first place and the subsequent use of anticoagulants are very much related. Indeed, Presiding Officer, in my view, this debate highlights questions which are crucial to the way we will need to deliver healthcare in the future, where technology is likely to enable patients to take a far more active role in managing long-term conditions, in particular with the advice and supervision of health professionals. And of course, central to all such developments throughout must be the certainty that a testing, monitoring or treatment method is done safely and appropriately, and that appropriate education and training are also provided, as well as there being recognition that what works well for one patient may not always be appropriate for someone else. So in closing, Presiding Officer, we've heard examples this evening of patients for whom self-testing is clearly the right approach and for whom it is working well. For example, my colleague Nanette Millen mentioned the Largs Medical Group as one example of best practice, where for patients it was found that the biggest benefit by far was the flexibility of being able to test when they want, and they should be supported to do that. And in fact, the current guidance from Health Improvement Scotland recognises there will be patients in just those situations. So I look forward to hearing the Minister's views and await with interest the final report by NICE that is due to be published in July on the effectiveness of self-testing. And can I thank again my colleague Nanette Millen for bringing forward tonight's debate on what is a key issue in enabling people to be in charge of their own blood testing and monitoring.
Many thanks. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I start by also congratulating Nanette Milne on securing the debate this evening and for a thoughtful contribution. I would simply observe to the Minister that clearly Nanette Milne has persistence in driving change in this area, having had a debate on this issue before, and I've no doubt will return to this unless improvements are made. I'm very conscious, Presiding Officer, that we're talking about 1.25 million patients in the UK receiving anticoagulation therapy and patients requiring this therapy increasing by as much as 10 to 20%. It's estimated that of that number, there are 74,000 patients in Scotland who self-manage. So we're talking about a tiny fraction, 740 people, because it's only 1% of that total. Now, when you compare that to England, where the total number is 2%, there's approximately 25,000 people self-managing. If you look at Germany, the number rises to 70,000, and we're finding that self-testing is increasingly supported in England and Wales, and the danger is, in that context, that Scotland will fall behind even further. Aileen MacLeod rightly drew our attention to ensuring that it would be a treatment that was safe and effective. But clearly, if numbers are increasing in England and Wales, they have judged it to be safe and effective there for those patients. But it does appear that NHS boards generally don't provide for support for self-monitoring in this area, despite the fact that increasing numbers perhaps would benefit from it. Nanette Milne quite rightly pointed out that there are only 3 health boards in Scotland that have protocols for self-management. We should congratulate them for actually doing work in this area, but clearly there is a need to do more if we are to provide that opportunity for the population across Scotland. There is, however, quite a lot of success in training young people to self-monitor and to self-manage their anticoagulation therapy. But disappointingly, no support for them when they move to adult clinics. And that question of transition from paediatric to adult services has been highlighted in a number of briefings. It does seem genuinely counterproductive that support for self-management comes to an end when they move to adult services, with many of them forced to attend anticoagulation clinics for testing, because having been in control and being able to manage their condition, they then lose that empowerment and cede control to others. So I would hope that we can look at this seriously. Now, I know that results from a Cochrane review suggested that self-monitoring or self-management can improve the quality of anticoagulant therapy, but it's not for every patient, and I recognise that. For some patients, it's not feasible. So we do require to identify and educate suitable patients. But I do think there is such an opportunity here to do more and to do it safely and effectively. The results are good. Nanette touched on some of them, but let me rehearse some of them again. 80% of poorly controlled patients moved into a well-controlled category after starting self-management. That, if anything, convinces me we need to do more. But equally, when you look at the improvement that results to patients in monetary terms, across the UK, it would prevent 500 strokes, save the NHS a minimum of £6 million, approximately 600,000 of that in Scotland. Other costings and other results suggest that for the 6,354 patients self-managing, in NHS Scotland over 5 years, comparing it to standard care, you would avoid strokes and embolisms for 360 of them, avoid deaths for 186, and total cost savings would be quite extraordinary. You're talking almost 3 million of the 11 million current cost. So I would recommend this to the Minister, particularly when you consider that the cost for clinics reduces from almost 7 million to £500,000, and the test strips for prevention are a mere £67 for 1 year. So it makes sense. It's good for budgets, which should interest us all. It's good for patients because we're providing them with power and control. And of course, the Scottish Government's policy direction is about self-management. So why not with anticoagulation therapy? Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I ask Michael Matheson to respond to the debate. Minister, 7 minutes or so.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I, like others, congratulate Nanette Millen in securing time for what has been a relatively short debate here this evening. Members will be aware that we have set out in our quality strategy in 2010 our clear commitment to make sure that patients receive safe, effective and person-centred care for every person every time they make use of our NHS. And as part of that commitment, we have supported people with long-term conditions to be active in their care. Our 2020 strategy and our quality strategy are complemented by our self-management strategy, Go On Yourself, which was written by people with long-term conditions themselves and adopted by the Scottish Government back in 2008. Since adoption, we have provided some £11.75 million through the Self-Management Fund to support people to manage their long-term conditions in the community. However, in addressing this particular debate tonight, I think we have to address some of the assumptions which are being set out within the motion, which I think may be slightly confused. Firstly, I think it's important to recognise that there is a difference between self-testing and self-management. They are not the same thing. Secondly, self-testing by warfarin patients is not the best option for the majority of patients in this particular group, who are elderly and may have cognitive impairments. Now, in Scotland, around 80,000 people are currently prescribed warfarin for the treatment of conditions such as irregular heartbeat, deep vein thrombosis, and for the management of mechanical heart devices. Making the blood clot less easily for these patients prevents blood clots forming and leading to strokes, heart attacks and pulmonary embolisms. But taking too much warfarin, of course, can cause death and disability due to internal bleeding, especially in the brain. Therefore, getting the right balance is absolutely vital for each of these patients, but it's also a challenge. Now, addressing some of the points that Nanette Millen raised and that Jackie Bailey has also made reference to, as are set out within the motion, it suggests that there has been a lack of progress in self-testing and self-monitoring compared to England and other parts of Europe. I'm not entirely sure on what basis that conclusion has been drawn. The only source of data regarding England that we've been able to identify has been from the company that produces one of the branded testing kits and machines. And on a European basis, we have to be very careful in how we deal with comparisons, because the provision of primary care is fundamentally different across different countries in Europe. The motion also that Nanette Millen proposes suggests that paediatric patients or their parents are supported by the National Cardiac Service at York Hill, self-manage. This is not the case. They do, however, self-test and forward their self-test results to a qualified haematology nurse who prescribes the medicine dosage, which is sent to the patient by a secure text. Then, when they move on to the adult service, there is one meeting with the adult team, after which the same arrangement continues. The motion also suggests that there's evidence it's clear that self-management of anticoagulant therapy provides patients with better health outcomes. In fact, it's worth considering the NICE guidance on this matter, their draft standards in February of this year regarding self-testing, which suggests it is more clinically effective than the usual approach of taking blood, sending it off to a lab and advising the patient by phone of the dose they should take. That's in self-testing rather than on self-management. Now, I'll give way to the member, of course.
Annette Milne.
I absolutely accept that there's a difference between the two, and I made that very, very clear in my debate I had a few years back. But, I mean, I accept also what you said about the children from York Hill self-testing rather than self-managing. But why should these same children, when they transit from paediatric adult services, then hand back their monitor so they're no longer self-testing?
Minister.
I've mentioned that they have the interview after they move into the adult service, and then they continue with the arrangements that were already in place. So I think there's an issue about some of the information that members may have been provided around the way in which services are actually delivered in this particular area. Now, some members may also be aware of the paper which was sponsored by one of the suppliers of self-testing technology, the York study. However, like the NICE study as well, the York paper is based on assumptions, including the average age of those on warfarin. The model assumes that the average age is 65 years. However, in Scotland, 77% of those on warfarin are older than this, and 28% are older than 75. These are important factors that need to be taken into consideration in any self-testing or self-management process that's introduced. There's also been a suggestion that Nanette Millen made, and that is that we should have a national service across the country. Again, I'm not persuaded that that's the approach to take, because I'm sure she'll recognise that boards have a responsibility to have local protocols in place for the delivery of services and to make use of the signed guidelines in this particular area and to allow them to adapt that to their own individual local circumstances. That, to me, is a much more appropriate way in which to take this type of issue forward. Members will also be aware that we have also made significant investment in our patient safety programme in Scotland, which has been extended to primary care, which pays particular attention to adopting best practice in how we can systematically make prescribing of warfarin safer. And this has already been adopted in 8 of our boards in NHS Ayrshire and Arn, Borders, Dumfries and Galloway, Fife, Forth Valley, Highland and Lothian and Grampian. And Nanette Millen also made reference to the experience with the GP practice in Largs. It is worth keeping in mind that the GP practice that was highlighted in that particular pilot had a significant level of resource provided to it for the purpose of it. In fact, it had 1 GP, 3 practice nurses, 2 healthcare assistants and an administrator in their anticoagulant team. Now, that's a model which simply would not be sustainable in being rolled out across the country. So, Presiding Officer, I hope members recognise that this is an area where we do understand that there are changes taking place, and we are keen to make sure that patients who are receiving anticoagulant medication in Scotland receive the best possible care. But the method and approach that we take in Scotland should be one which is safe and effective and appropriate to the circumstances for each individual patient.
Thank you, Minister. And that concludes Nanette Millen's debate on self-management of anticoagulation therapy. And I now close this meeting of Parliament.